Alrighty, welcome everybody who's seeing myself right now. I'm waiting for everything to connect for Twitch and YouTube. Looks like we're up on all the others, so we'll just wait for that. But meanwhile, I am the breakdown with Birkenhoff, as you see in front of you, with my YouTube channel, and I'm the breakdown with WB on Twitch, DLive, and Trovo, so you can find all my channels there when I go live on streams. And I try to post at least a couple of videos a month just on my YouTube channel for what I call solo videos, where I talk about a topic or something that's kind of on my mind, or just something a little bit more prone to a solo video and not so much a stream. If you're new to my channel and new to my type of content and videos, basically on my streams I tend to pick a topic and try to look into the topic, and I call it learning live on air. So essentially I find a topic idea and I find articles and scientific journals on it, I research it, and then I start to stream a couple days later from some of my research and general thoughts I have, and kind of just learn live with everybody all at once here. And I try to look at all your comments and give feedback on what I think is good or bad. I highly appreciate anybody that has any questions about a topic or maybe an opinion on the topic. This topic, what we're going over today, is gerrymandering. And gerrymandering is a very hot political topic in today for many reasons, really. And it's been blamed on mostly the Republican Party, but both parties have been involved in gerrymandering before, and we're going to get into some of that a little bit later. But if you follow any sort of political content or follow political news by any standard, you are going to be hearing about gerrymandering at some point, and it's a very hot political topic over this last election, and several states, including Texas, are redistricting their lines, and redistricting is part of potential gerrymandering. If redistricting is done right, then gerrymandering is of no issue and of no concern. But if redistricting is done wrong, then gerrymandering could be a potential side effect from the content of redistricting lines and coming up with new or improved districts, or whatever you want to necessarily call that. So I'm going to click on this video and make sure we don't have sound for it. Unfortunately, my Safari, where I have everything else, doesn't like to work with YouTube, or whatever you want to necessarily. So I have to have that on Google Chrome, and I'm not really sure why. But it's whatever, I guess. So I just have that up on that screen, but everything else I'm able to see your comments all at once here, and eventually I'll get good enough to where I don't have to have all these screens up here, and I can talk about whatever I want to talk about, and just have to look at one screen and make my life a lot easier, because I do want to make sure I catch all of your comments, because I do appreciate everybody that decides to stop by for part of my stream or however long you want to stay when talking about whatever topic I have explored. Real quick, before I start talking about this topic, on my YouTube I am going to have recap videos of all of my longer streams. I don't know exactly when I'm going to have time to post all of them up to my YouTube, so they may be delayed by a week or so. But if you're not interested in hearing an entire stream, but a topic does interest you, what I've done before, or you notice a certain topic that interests you, you can go and find that recap video on my YouTube channel. And the two recent streams that I've just done are over police reform and criminal justice reform. So I will have recap videos of those up on my YouTube channel in a short time, hopefully, and including this topic for today. So we'll go ahead and just start with a general definition of gerrymandering. Anybody who doesn't necessarily know what a term is, or just wants to look up something, goes to Google, right? And you put blah 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 definition. So this is just what we're going to start off with, and then we're going to really get into what gerrymandering is and kind of what it's based off of. So gerrymandering is this: manipulate the boundaries of an electoral constitution. Repeat. Manipulate the boundaries of an electoral constituency so as far to favor one party or class, to achieve a result by manipulating the boundaries of an electoral constituency. So that is just your real basic definition of gerrymandering. And as I just said at the kind of introduction to this vehicle, there is a difference between simply gerrymandering and the concept that gerrymandering is based off of. And the concept it is based off of is redistricting. And every so often, your legislators of your state get together, or of your state get together and decide how they're going to draw district lines. And in opinion, how these district lines are drawn gives you a percentage of your voting population from within these districts. So if you want a real simple definition of gerrymandering, it is basically the concept that when you redistrict the lines, you are only targeting a certain percentage of your people. And you have your different types of gerrymandering. You have your packing gerrymandering, and you have your more spread out approach of that concept. And packing is basically where you make your district 60% Republican or 60% Democrat. But just to keep this example simple, you have your district of 60% Republican or 70% Republican or whatever very large number of your constituencies being Republican. So you know that this District 1 or District A, normally they're District 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and on and on and on and on and on. But you get what I'm saying. You know that first district, or wherever you draw it, that has 60% or 60+% of a certain party is going to win that election, and therefore whatever election results that come out of that county is uncompetitive. And that is one way where the concept of gerrymandering really gets in the way of American politics, because if you make your district a certain percentage and a certain way and sway voters to pick that perspective and pick that party, because of your overall percentage, then basically what you're doing is making that one district completely uncompetitive, and people are not going to want to vote for the opposite candidate because they know that the candidate's not going to win. But another funny thing about packing districts is the effect you get when you have a district too high of your party. If you have your district that has too many constituencies of one party, too high of a percentage, then you could run the risk of your own people saying, oh yeah, Jerry, he's going to win. I know he's going to win. He wins every year. And they don't go to vote. And there's a possibility enough people won't show up to vote that district gets lost. But really, it makes the voters not feel like their vote matters. So if you pack a district, you run the risk of not just defranchising the other party and giving the other party no chance of winning, but also you run the risk of your own constituencies feeling like their vote doesn't matter because they know that their party candidate's going to win. And maybe that is a good thing because they want their party candidate to win. But either way, you're running a real serious risk of potentially making voters feel like their result doesn't matter. But you also have the strategy and the approach of gerrymandering where you spread out all the districts and you spread out your constituencies from all districts or many districts. So that approach is basically redistricting lines to where you have just a little bit of a majority or enough of the majority vote that you know you're going to win most of the districts and maybe lose a couple just because the other candidate was that much better, or maybe your candidate did something stupid and lost the faith of the voters or whatever it might be. So essentially you spread your constituents out across all these districts so that you win more districts than potentially lose districts. So you have kind of your two strategies of gerrymandering are redistricting. Now I want to make myself very clear when we start talking about this, is redistricting is done every single legislative cycle, especially when the opposite party wins the legislator of that state. Most of the times they go out and decide to redistrict the lines to favor their candidates in favor of their party. It's done no matter who ultimately overtakes that legislative cycle or the turn of winning the legislator. I feel like I'm repeating myself a little bit, but I want to make that clear. So it's done over both parties. But simply redistricting lines to favor your candidate isn't necessarily gerrymandering in a way. And gerrymandering is one of those hard concepts to particularly define because there is several cases, I believe 2 cases, that went to the Supreme Court trying to define the term of gerrymandering. And basically the court said we cannot put a legal definition of what gerrymandering is, but we know when it happens. So essentially the court was saying that although we have this concept of gerrymandering and we can look at it on paper, look at the results from the state because they were redistricting lines to disfranchise African American or Latino or whatever minority group vote. They can look at the map and say, yeah, it does appear to be this way, but there's no real way we can definitely define exactly what the concept of gerrymandering is from a legal format or a legal frame. Therefore, it's left to politics and left to the government to ultimately put a definition on gerrymandering. So because of that, there's not really a disincentive or a concern for somebody to not want to therefore make their candidates win more often than less or gerrymander. So that was one recent-ish development that came out of gerrymandering and the concept from the Supreme Court and court systems and everything. So I wanted to make that very clear. And anybody who's maybe listening now or watching later, I would be interested to hear what you think about the concept of gerrymandering and if you think you could put a legal definition for it. Because we're going to later look at some maps and concepts or drawings or whatever you want to call it of places that have been caught for potential gerrymandering, or it looks very suspicious the way their district lines were drawn. And one of the reasons for this was the Supreme Court basically came out and said that you need to have a majority-minority district. So essentially they were like, look, we know that the reason you're doing this is to defranchise African American, Latino, Asian, any minority group. We know that you're doing this. So now we're going to mandate, make sure that you have to have a district that represents a minority. Not all your districts, not most of your districts, just at least one majority-minority district in your state or in your area. So states were getting a little bit dicey with their information and how they wanted to do their minority-majority districts, and their districts looked very odd. They looked very ziggy-zaggy, they looked very thin, they looked very puzzly. And what I mean by that is, especially when we start looking at the maps of some of these electoral maps, or these redistricting lines, you start to see very wavy, snake-like patterns. So yes, all the districts are continuous, which is something districts need to be. They're not necessarily compact. So there's 2 terms that ultimately you would want your redistricting to be if you live in an ideal ward. And I just kind of said those 2. You want your district to be continuous and you want your district to be compact. And if you have both of those results, then your redistrict looks good and it's not really that suspicious. Maybe you are doing something suspicious, but it's a lot harder to ultimately tell that you are when you redistrict that way. And ultimately, that's how redistricting should be done. So continuous is kind of self-explanatory, but you don't want your District 1 to be on the left side and then just go to the right side, but not have any sort of flow between the left and the right. So in other words, you can't have District A or District 1 Part A on the left and then have District 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then at the end have District 1 Part B. That's not really allowed when you're redistricting lines. So they have to be, well, continuous. So then you run into the problem when you look at gerrymandering in particular. You start to see, you have your District 1 start on the left, and then it has a snake-like, very thin pattern that runs to the opposite side of the state or the opposite side of many districts and is technically continuous, but not compact. So that's the second variable you want your redistricts to be. You want your redistricts to be together, continuous, and compact. So you want your District 1 to be District 1 from the left to the right and not have any sort of snake pattern, but just one big blob that exists as the district. So you might be thinking, well, who defines this and who redraws, who is the one that redistricts these lines or makes up these lines or whatever concept you want to ultimately say? Well, this is where it comes into the state legislators, and that's what I was mentioning earlier. Normally when a state legislator wins over the state that was previously held by the opposite party, they're going to want to redistrict the lines. And the Supreme Court has came out and said that you have to redistrict your lines at least once every decade. I know that's the Supreme Court way for Texas, but I believe that is all states as well. So even if it's not all states as well, most states do fall into the category of at least redistricting their lines once every 12 years. So I believe that is a Supreme Court suggestion or mandate or whatever word you want to use for that. But I'll continue on here. So basically, especially for Texas, the Supreme Court came out and said that you have to at least redistrict your lines once every 12 years. And Texas especially has often redistricted a lot more than every 12 years. But ultimately, your state legislator, the people that hold the majority power and not the minority power, the majority party, in other words, will oftentimes decide to redistrict their lines when they were previously the minority party, and that is to favor their candidates. So even if you take the most generous approach of redistricting, you want your redistricts to favor your party. Everybody would want to do that. Politics is a very brutal society and a very brutal type of, I don't want to necessarily, it is government, but I'm trying to think of an example really. But ultimately, when you're the one that controls power, you're going to want to therefore make sure that your party's going to win in the future. So then, because you have that power as a state legislator and as the party majority, you're now able to redistrict your lines to now favor your party. And that just makes sense. And that's not necessarily gerrymandering, but it can lead to gerrymandering. And this is where ultimately the bad part of gerrymandering exists, because there's not a legal term placed on what gerrymandering exactly is. Yet, at the same time, if you show someone a map of this district that goes from the left side to the right side and is a snake, they're going to go, yeah, there's something fishy there. There's something weird. Why would you want your district to look that way? There's just something suspicious. And you go, well, it does look suspicious, but we can't necessarily say that it is. So it's a very weird concept that goes between, ultimately people, when they look at these maps, know if a certain district looks a little bit suspicious, but at the same time, they can't ultimately do anything about it. And it can lead to several consequences, as I was explaining earlier, where it leads voters really on both parties to be disfranchised and not really want to go out and vote. But as a political party, where your only concept is as the party chair or as the head of your legislator for your party, is to make sure that your party wins in the future because of your own motivations through wanting to be reelected, or because you want to see your party winning in the future. Because there are several states out there that have restrictions on state legislators for how long they can run. I believe it's Louisiana. I could be wrong, but one of the states, I know for sure, only allows their state legislators to run for, I think it's 12 years. So after their 12 years is over, they could no longer be in the state legislature. But you have a lot of cases of lifelong people who go into state legislators, or former senators or representatives that go to be state legislators of their party. So ultimately, it's the same concept, because even if you only can serve a minimum amount of time in the state legislature as the majority party, you're still going to want to make sure that your party ends up winning more than it loses. That's just simply human nature and how we exist as humans, especially when we start talking about politics. So that is one major concept about that. But let's read a little bit about redistricting and what redistrict.edu has to say about it. State legislators. In most states, the state legislature has primary control of the redistricting process, both for the state legislators and for congressional districts. 34 state legislators have primary control of their own district lines, and 39 legislators have primary control over the congressional lines in their state, including 7 of the states that are likely to have just one congressional district. In most of these states, district lines pass just like regular legislation, with a majority vote in each legislative chamber. The first draft is often done by the legislative committees chosen by and under the watchful eye of the legislative leadership. And usually these bills are subject to a veto by the governor and potentially override by the legislators. Override thresholds range from simply majority to 2/3 majority. Connecticut and Maine both require supermajorities, that being a 2/3 majority to approve the vote in the House, to approve a redistricting plan. In New York and Washington, the legislature can override other parties with a supermajority, and in Ohio, a bipartisan supermajority takes a first shot before another commission takes over. In 5 of the states above, Connecticut, Florida, Maryland, Mississippi, and North Carolina, set district lines by joint resolution without the potential for a gubernatorial veto. So that would basically be if both their legislative houses, because usually you have for ease of the example, you have a lower house and then you have an upper house. And they're called something a little bit different, but we don't ultimately have to get into the super details of this. But ultimately, have your lower house and you have your upper house. So if your lower house agrees to redistrict this way, and your upper house looks at it, maybe changes a few things, and then agrees on it, then it gets passed in those states. But most of the time, that then goes to the governor, and the governor has to approve. And the governor can change a few things with his power, especially when it comes to certain states. For example, in Texas, the governor has a lot of power, more than some other states that the governor doesn't have as much power to do things. So I believe in Texas, and I could be wrong, but I believe the governor would have the power to disapprove of those redistrict lines if he were to do so. And somebody in comments will probably correct me if I'm wrong about that. But most of the time, the power goes between these lower houses and upper houses and how they choose to redistrict lines. And sometimes these redistricting lines are done by a committee where they are selected to do so and research and come up with whatever lines they come up with for the census vote, or in that case, and that committee then draws up the lines and we go on from there. I believe most states particularly run in that way, but the main thing here is that redistricting is done by the legislative houses, because normally states have at least a lower and upper house of legislators. Now we read about some advisory commissions. 4 of the states above, Iowa, Maine, Utah, and Vermont, appoint advisory committees to help advise the legislator about where the district line should be drawn. In most states, the legislative committees draft initial redistricting plans, just like they draft most legislation. But in some of these states with advisory committees, non-legislators are also invited to formally participate on the initial drafting body. Advisory commissions recommend district plans to the legislator, but the legislator has the final say. The commissions vary widely. Some are created by statute and cannot be changed or eliminated by the legislator, and some are written into the state constitution, and some like Iowa, amount to a much stronger and more independent default than others. talks about some backup commissions and different types of commissions. We don't ultimately have to get into those details. I more just wanted to bring up that point in redistricting and how redistricting is kind of done by the legislator, and depending on your state gives certain powers over the legislator than other states, and that could determine how your lines, wherever in what state you live in, are done. In Texas, I believe there is a committee, but we'll go on from here. Redistricting is the process by which a new congressional and state legislative district boundaries are done. All United States representative and state legislators are elected from political divisions called district. District lines are redrawn every 10 years following the completion of the United States Census. The federal government implements that districts must have nearly equal populations and must not discriminate on the basis of race or ethnicity. Congressional redistricting. In 33 states, state legislators play the dominant role in congressional redistricting. In 8 states, commissions draw congressional district lines. In 2 states, hybrid systems are used, in which the legislators share redistricting authority with commissions. And Texas is a hybrid, technically, but that we can get into that debate in a whole separate video. But I don't ultimately want to spend too much time on that, because that could, yeah. In 33 states, state legislators play the dominant role in state legislative redistricting. Commissions draw state legislative district lines in 14 states. In these states, hybrid systems are used. The states themselves determine their own redistricting methods. These methods vary state by state and sometimes within a state. For example, different methods may apply to the congressional redistricting than to state legislative redistricting. The article details redistricting methods by state for both congressional and state legislative redistricting. Federal requirements for congressional redistricting. According to Article 1, Section 4 of the United States Constitution, the states and their legislators have primary authority in determining the times, place, and manner of congressional elections. Congress may also pass laws regulating congressional elections. Article 1, Section 2 of the United States Constitution stipulates that congressional representatives be appointed to the state by basis of population. There are 435 seats in the United States House of Representatives. Each seat is allotted a proportion of those seats based on the size of its population relative to the other states. Constitutionally, a state may give in seats in a house if its population grows or loses seats if it's in its population. In 1964, the United States Supreme Court ruled Weasley v. Sanders that the population of House districts must be equal as nearly as predictable. So that is basically the idea that you gain and lose your House seats by your population. So California is suspected to lose, I believe, 1 or 2 House seats, and a couple of others, I believe New York is one as well, is expected to lose a House seat. So that is very important to grasp, because most of those House seats are probably going to end up going to Texas and a few other states. I believe Texas is suspected to pick up 3 House seats, so that would determine how the redistricting lines are also done when it comes to the legislative process here in Texas for the lines. So looking at how Texas is going to redistrict the lines could determine a lot of details when it comes to the future votes 2 years from now, or even 4 years from now, or however many years you want to give before the next redistricting is done. Federal requirements for the state legislative redistricting. The United States Constitution is signed on the issue of state legislative redistricting. In the mid-1960s, the United States Supreme Court issued a series of rulings that an effort to clarify standards for state legislative redistricting. In Reynolds versus Sims, the court ruled that equal protection clause of the United States Constitution demands no less than substantively equal state legislative representation for all citizens of all places as well as all races. According to All About Redistricting, it has become accepted that a redistricting plan will be constitutionally suspect if the largest and smallest districts within a state jurisdiction are more than 10% apart. So it talks a little bit about state-by-state procedures, but I wanted to kind of look at the map. According to Ballotpedia, they consider Texas to be a legislator dominant perspective, the legislative dominant style, and California is considered to be commission, and you have Florida that's considered to be legislator dominant. You have Maine, I think it is, Maine and New York, it looks like, are hybrids. And you have, if I'm thinking of my geography right here, you have, no, that's Wisconsin, the state next to Wisconsin. What would that be? But they're considered to be non-applicable, so they don't necessarily know. Delaware is non-applicable. Montana, that's what I was thinking of. Montana is non-applicable as well, according to Ballotpedia, and Texas is considered to be legislator dominant or suspect to veto. And this brings me to a good point. You can find these articles where I'm talking about either on my YouTube in the channel description or by joining my Discord that should be linked wherever you're watching this video if you want to look at these own articles for you, because Ballotpedia does have a really good breakdown of how redistricting is done per the states and the process itself. But I just want to read this one other thing and talk about their data from here, and then we'll move on to our video where it talks about gerrymandering and see if we can learn anything new from the video from what I've said so far. State legislative districts. In 33 of the 50 states, state legislators play the dominant role in state legislative redistricting. Commissions draw state legislative district lines in 14 states. These 3 states and hybrid systems are used in which state legislators share redistricting authority with commissions. So we'll go down to Texas because that's where I live, and I'm interested to see what they consider here. Texas is legislator dominant and suspect to veto. We can go to California just to get the opposite, because California is pretty opposite compared to Texas. California here is commission-based and non-political commission. That's another concept. Most of these times, these commissions, when they are used for determining redistricting lines, are still done by people who are representatives of the state from both parties. So they have a political motivation and political motives to it. There are some states, and looks to be California from Ballotpedia, that have nonpartisan members that redistrict these lines and have nonpartisan committee members that have to serve certain requirements for serving in that committee. So I believe you can't have been a candidate or couldn't have switched your party in the last 2 years, and there's just a few other kind of basic requirements that have to be met to consider you as a nonpartisan member to serve on that committee of looking at the data and redrawing these district lines. Because no matter what way you slice it, it is a very complicated process on trying to make a district that is fair and ultimately is probably still going to favor your party. Now, in the case where you have non-political commissions, in the ideal world, they wouldn't necessarily look to favor whatever side they believe, but when it comes to human nature, they're probably at least going to have a party they favor, even if they subconsciously don't think they do. It's just because we're humans, and that's ultimately the way politics works, especially because of how partisan it is. But if you ask anybody off the street and you think about the ideal political format, you would think that every state would probably want to have a non-political commission to redistrict their lines and not have a dominant majority party redistrict the lines just to favor themselves, and have a more fair approach for all districts and have more fair elections across all of the districts. But it's just simply not the way politics works right now. But I thought we would play this quick TED education video about about gerrymandering, just to see if they can teach us a little bit more or explain it maybe a little bit better than I have so far.
Most people have heard the word gerrymandering once or twice, probably during a presidential election. What exactly is gerrymandering? Essentially, it's the process of giving one political party an advantage over another political party by redrawing district lines. It's like Democrats trying to gain an advantage over Republicans, or Republicans trying to gain an advantage over Democrats. You see, each party wants to gain as many districts as possible so they can do things like control the state budget or set themselves up to win even more districts in the future. So, to understand how this process began and how it continues today, we must go back to 1812 in Massachusetts. Elbridge Gerry, the governor of Massachusetts, supported and signed a bill to allow redistricting. That is, redrawing the boundaries that separate districts. The catch? The new lines would favor Gerry's own political party, the Democratic-Republican Party, which no longer exists. You see, Gerry wanted his party to win as many state Senate seats as possible. The more members of your party who vote, the more likely you are to win an election. The new lines were drawn to include loads of areas that would help Governor Gerry in the future. They were so strange looking that someone said the new districts looked like a salamander. The Boston Gazette added Gerry's name.
So they're talking a little bit about the person that came up with the idea of gerrymandering, because this wasn't always the case, as we have heard from this TED education video briefly. And also I just wanted to pause it here to where you can look at this district and kind of what I was explaining earlier, which you have your idea of a district having to be continuous. So you can see from this side all the way up to here, it's technically one piece. So technically it would still be considered continuous, but this district isn't really compact. As you can see here, it's not really all together on one solid block or one solid square or whatever shape you want to say, like say this district where it is continuous and compact. So you kind of could see that as an example as well. But we'll continue on with what they say.
Name to the word salamander, and voila, gerrymandering, the process of dividing up and redrawing districts to give your political party an advantage. So how exactly does someone go about protecting their own political party and actually gerrymandering a district? There are two successful practices: packing a district and cracking a district. Packing is the process of drawing district lines and packing in your opponents like cattle into as few districts as possible. If more districts equals more votes, the fewer the districts there are, the fewer votes the opposition party will get. Packing, then, decreases the opponent's voter strength and influence. Cracking is the opposite, taking one district and cracking it into several pieces. This is usually done in districts where your opponent has many supporters. Cracking spreads these supporters out among many districts, denying your opponent a lot of votes. When you have a large number of people who would generally vote for one type of party, those folks are known as a voting bloc. Cracking is a way to break that all up. So when would a party choose to pack their opponent's districts rather than crack them? Well, that really depends on what the party needs. To dilute your opponent's voters, you could pack them into one district and leave the surrounding districts filled with voters of your own party. Or, if you and your party are in power when it's time to redraw district lines, you could redraw districts and crack up a powerful district and spread your opponent's voters out.
Because usually when you think about gerrymandering, you think of more of the packing strategy, and I was explaining that a little bit earlier. And I thought this video did a good job at really explaining it with graphics, because I am kind of a visual learner more than auditory. So it's good to kind of see these maps and animation of they're explaining kind of what I explained a little bit earlier. But I thought they did a really good job at explaining what cracking is, because normally when you think about cracking as a political strategy for redistricting, it doesn't particularly make that much sense. Why would you want to spread yourself across many districts instead of knowing that you're simply going to win districts? Oh, thank you for the raid, Hell Knight. I appreciate that. And Emma says, I don't know what is stupider, elections or voters. Participating in your own subjugation is pretty damn stupid. I don't know Okay. That's an interesting thing that I was going to talk about a little bit earlier or a little bit later, but I guess I could bring up now. Is the factor of simply what gerrymandering does to the voters and the idea of American politics and American voters today. Because ultimately, I think it comes down to two major things, especially this most recent election. No matter who you voted for yourself or who you think won the election, with Biden versus Trump, both I feel like both voters came away off of that district knowing that the system itself is at least a little bit wrong, a little bit bad. And that's a very bad thing to have in American politics. And I also feel like the idea of gerrymandering itself has ultimately led American politics to be the way it is today. Because through packing or through cracking or through just how redistricting is done, they're able to very easily manipulate how districts are formed to be able to make sure that their candidate wins a particular side or is whatever you want to happen. And that's just a very sad thing. So I do think a lot of people, to Emma's point, are simply feeling like their vote doesn't matter anymore, no matter what political side you ultimately fall on. And I do think that that is starting to become more and more true. Even though despite this last election having the highest turnout rate and both candidates receiving the most votes in American history, with Joe Biden winning because he won the popular vote. But even if you took Joe Biden out and just included Trump's results, he still had enough votes to beat the previous record and be the most popular candidate. So both candidates received a tremendous amount of votes. So yes, turnout rate was higher in this last presidential cycle, but I still don't think that it's ultimately a leading cause to what we could expect here in the future when it comes to voting, because American turnout rate, even with the highest turnout rate possible, still didn't reach over, I believe it was 60%. I believe it was like 58%, if I remember right, of voter turnout for the presidential election. So we're still not having very high voter turnout numbers in the American politics system. So voters, even for this last election cycle that was the most popular, still doesn't ultimately tell a complete story. So I definitely do agree with you, and you have people on the political spectrums who are really into politics and simply don't care about politics. And even the people who are really into politics sometimes share the same sentiment, where they don't really think that their vote ultimately matters because the election is either rigged or they don't really care to have their vote particularly matter. I don't know if I'm particularly explaining myself very well here, but basically what I'm trying to say is either through gerrymandering leading to people feeling like their vote doesn't matter, or because just the way politics works and how politically divided we are as a nation, ultimately feel like their vote doesn't particularly matter. And hello there, Eat Noodles. I think that's a cat emoji. I can't particularly tell from here. But hopefully you're having a good day, and if Hell Knight, if you're still here, hopefully you're having a good day as well. But we'll finish this rest of the video and then we can move on.
Across several neighboring districts. So, Governor Jerry in 1812 wanted to gain an advantage for his party and redrew district lines in his state in such a crazy way, we have a whole new word and way of thinking about how political parties can gain advantages over their opponents. Politicians think of creative ways to draw districts every few years. So, the next time an election comes around and politicians ask people to vote, be sure to look up the shape of your district and the districts that surround it. How wide does your district stretch across your state? Are all of the districts in your state relatively the same shape? How many other districts does your district touch? But always be sure to ask yourself, does my district look like a salamander?
So they kind of ended the video with a good point. And I also think it hints to kind of what Emma's talking about. And I don't necessarily want to speak for Emma if she's still here. And maybe she could explain if she thinks gerrymandering was one of the aspects to why she doesn't feel that confident in American politics or the vote itself. But there is a very good point where if you're the voter and you ultimately have the choice to turn out and vote for your candidate, either through whatever party, Republican, Democrat, whatever you want to say, and you then have to research your district before you can even do so, you know something is wrong. So basically, as an American voter or as a voter, you would ultimately want to go to the election knowing that one, your district is competitive, two, your district is compact, three, your district is continuous. So in other words, whatever district you are in is a solid and politically competitive district. Because if we could have every place in the United States, every place in your state be a competitive district, we would probably have better politicians serving us in the House and serving us in the Senate and ultimately serving us as a president or vice president or whatever word you want to use for so on and so on. So redistricting is huge because ultimately it also comes down to this. People find themselves voting for presidential elections and Senate elections more than they find themselves voting for local elections through the county sheriff or through the your local legislator, through your local bills, through your local governor, through your local representative, blah, 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 blah. You get the point. People don't really ultimately research these local representatives that much. Yet these local representatives, these legislators, are the ones that have their hand on what happens in your state. So if you don't care about local elections and you let this legislator win and he goes on to ultimately make all these districts misshaped and salamanders, as the TED Talk referred it to, then you have ultimately screwed your state and screwed where you live, because now that person is going to make sure that his party wins the vote. And it's a rather simple thing because it ultimately comes down to human nature once again. As a human, and if you have the power to look at redistricts and to draw new lines, and your party is whatever party, you're going to make sure that you ultimately win future elections either through selfish motives of wanting to make sure that you win again, or your friend next door, or your next district, or your senator buddy, or your house buddy, make sure he wins his election because he is part of your party. You get what I'm saying? I think it's a rather simple idea, even if you're just talking about human nature. That's just the way it is. But ultimately, people not caring so much about their local elections leads to gerrymandering and stuff like this happening, because it's a very easy for these legislators or for these House members to win their local elections because of incumbent bias or whatever reason you want to say, and therefore once they control the legislator, go, oh, look, now we can redraw the lines. Or, oh, look, let's redraw them a little bit better now. Let's make sure we win. It's a very easy concept, a very easy idea. So, even though federal elections or presidential elections matter, obviously, it's still the concept of making sure that as a voter, even if you feel like your vote doesn't ultimately matter, you still decide to show up for at least your local elections. Because I would argue it almost needs to be the opposite. If you're not going to vote because you don't think your vote matters or whatever reason you want to say, I would argue against that through looking at legislators and the impact a legislator has on your local government. So basically what I'm trying to say here is, if I had to vote for a particular election, I would almost want to vote for a local election through governor or through a legislator or whatever, more than I would want to ultimately vote for who is going to represent me as president. And that may seem a little bit weird, a little bit extreme, but it ultimately comes down to what you want your individual state rights to be. Yes, the president does have the power of executive orders or of bills or does have a major impact. But if you ultimately want to make sure that you are safe within your state and you have bills that represent you as a Texan or represent you as a I was going to say Canadian, but I represent you as a Kentuckian or Floridian or whatever you want to say, then you want to make sure that you vote in your local elections and you elect people that represent your values, because legislators have a huge impact on what you can do in your political system. And yes, that's how I kept thinking of Florida Man in my mind, Noodle, so we're thinking alike. Some of my friends and fellow streamers that I'm kind of a part of, I guess you would say, for the Freedom Scoop Network, Most of them live in Florida, so it's rather funny because one of them really does look like he would be on a Florida Man article. It's pretty funny. Anyway, but we'll read about this article a little bit. And Noodles is from Canada, if I remember right. And I don't know if Canada is suspect to gerrymandering or not there as well. But I would ultimately think any political system that draws districts would potentially have gerrymandering happening. So we're going to look at some examples of what they say are the 12 worst House district examples. The 12 worst House district examples label gerrymandering the 30 dozen. And this is by David Mears in 2019. And I'll read a little bit here. How do you know when you are seeing a gerrymandered district? Maybe it looks like a duck or a snake or a pair of earmuffs, or maybe there's no obvious sign that the mapmakers play games with the contours in order to ensure a particular electoral outcome inside those boundaries. The last contest using the current set of congressional maps are a year away. After that, the results of the 2020 census will play a huge role in redistricting of the entire county. That's the biggest concept here, and this is why I wanted to talk about gerrymandering for today's episode, because you have no idea how big it's going to play a role in this year alone. In 2021, because we're still waiting for the census data. Many states are going to redistrict their lines based off of the 2020 census. And some states are going to lose House representatives, some states are going to gain seats. And depending on that is going to depend on how they redraw these districts. So it's a very huge thing, and this is why, once again, I wanted to talk about gerrymandering for today's episode. Because Texas is going to be redistricting, and probably any other state out there is going to redistrict the lines. Noodle says here, in 1964, the federal government delegated the drawing of boundaries for the federal electoral districts to the nonpartisan agency elections in Canada, which answers to the parliament rather than the government of the day. As a result, gerrymandering is not generally a major issue in Canada, except at the civic level. Well, that's good to hear, Noodles. That's very good to hear that Canada does that. And ultimately, that is a very smart approach, because there are some states in the United States, like California, that have independent committees that try to redistrict the lines that are supposed to be nonpartisan. But as I said earlier, it's very hard to find anybody who is nonpartisan when it comes to American politics today. So I kind of argue against the claim that these representatives are completely nonpartisan. So, I don't know. But that is a very smart idea, because ultimately I'm for a committee or for anybody who redistricts these lines as not being somebody who is a legislator who can decide on it just based off of his party alone. And those who, I keep saying legislator, those basically don't know what legislators are, is they basically have the power to write bills and resolutions, and bills and resolutions are different, but they have the power to pass a bill or to pass a resolution with their fellow legislator. And most of the states have a lower house and a upper legislator house, and those two houses in most states have to agree on something. So let's say, for example, the lower house wants to pass a bill on a coronavirus budget plan. It then has to get passed through the lower house, and then it goes to the upper house. And the upper house has the power to veto it, has the power to include different things, take things out. That's called amendments. They're able to chop apart this bill and add their own perspective or add their own ideas. Then you ultimately have to, if the upper house then says, yes, we agree on this bill, in the instance of Texas, it then goes to the governor, and the governor now has the power to pass this or not. And in the particular example of Texas, the governor has a power to veto that vote. So even if it passes the lower house and upper house of the legislature, it can still be knocked down by the governor himself, and then they completely have to restart the system. And that is why in the particular state of Texas, we don't get many things done when it comes from the legislative process. Yet, when it comes to redistricting, Texas is one of the more easier places to potentially have gerrymandering because of the way redistricting is done and ultimately is given to whoever has the power in the legislative branch. And Eat Noodle says cracking and packing. Yes, we talked about that earlier. I'm not sure when exactly you rated Hint here from the Hell Knights channel. But we were talking about those two concepts as well from that video and before. And ultimately, most of the time when you talk about redistricting, people are talking about packing more than cracking. But we'll look at kind of both of those examples here. And I also mentioned the snake, and that once again goes back to the two ideas that proper districts should have, with the two ideas being continuous and compact. So this district is technically continuous because it meets. You can drive your car, your truck from this side, go all the way up to here, go down to here, go over here, drop your package off here, drop your package off here, shop for your groceries here, go all the way up here and visit your grandparents and not have any problem because it is continuous. But it is not compact like this one. Technically, this is a lot more compact, even though this does look a little bit weird. But there are cases where districts are supposed to look a little bit weird if they're trying to be ultimately more fair for their style and everything. So there is that. But we're going to look at some examples of redistricting and some bad examples of gerrymandering. So we asked some experts. They show their experts. We don't have to read the experts. Number one is beside Lake Erie, and it has here. It starts here through district, goes all the way over to here, and then goes to here, and then you have your two dots here that I believe are in the. I believe it's a river, if I am remembering right, or is it lake? Lake. It's a lake. Yeah, Lake Erie. So you have your two like islands that are technically a part of the district. And this is another kind of example that I mentioned previously at the start, was that you have oftentimes, especially when the court ruled and you had to have a majority-minority district, you had the case in Louisiana where simply it looked kind of like this, where it was just a very small straight line from one side of the state to the other side of the state that they put all of their minorities into. So the idea that somebody on this side of Michigan believes the same thing as somebody on this side of Michigan is very unlikely. So it is a little bit suspicious that you would have a district that is this thin. Yes, it is continuous, but it's not very compact. So it does look a little bit weird when you're talking about having a proper district or proper district line. And we'll read what one guy said here. Fireman, Ohio's so-called Snake by Lake 9th District, which stretches from Toledo to Cleveland, I think I butchered that, is so thin and strangely shaped that they have actually drove to Lake Erie to monitor sea levels with respect to the constituency of the district. They are concerned that climate change could make the district non-continuous and consequently alter the next round of redistricting. Toledo. Yeah, that's it. Thank you, Doodles. Yeah, I knew as soon as I said that, I'm like, wait a second. Yeah, I am terrible with names. That's why it's fantastic that I stream. That makes perfect sense. Like half of the time, people's Twitch names have to be like breaking it down really, really particular. So that's fantastic. Anyway, we'll have our second example here, where you had your district starting from here, going down to here, going over here. Basically, when you talk about gerrymandering, most of the time, a bad gerrymandered district is a district that looks like a snake, and this one looks like a snake. We'll go to the next one. Alabama's capital, you have your 7th, 3rd, 2nd district, and the 7th district here. See, this one is a little bit interesting, because usually when you look at districts, if you were to just automatically look at how everything looks, I wouldn't think that this district looks particularly suspicious ultimately. So it'll be interesting to see what they have to say in their points here. But this isn't as bad as the one above here that is basically just a snake. The 7th district is living proof that racial gerrymandering is partisan gerrymandering and vice versa. It is heavily Democrat and gives off several narrow that impacts the major black population centers, including far off Birmingham. In the special Senate election of 2017, Democrat Doug Jones won a statewide popular vote by 1.5 percentage points. Yet the only district he carried was 7th, which is 63% African American. Without these, Alabama's 7th member of House delegation could possibly have a second Democrat and potentially black member in addition to Terrell Sewell. So basically they're saying that Alabama drew their district too big is kind of what I was reading from there. Because, like I was mentioning earlier, if you just look at this doesn't ultimately look as bad as it does when you look at Baltimore and their snake-like district. But that does appear to be an example where they redistricted to lower the party's impact of only having one candidate instead of potentially two or maybe even three candidates if it was done by the other party's state legislator. Baton Rouge is our next example here. Louisiana's 6th district owes its strange shape to the 2nd district, which looks like it's been inserted inside the 6th and was drawn to comply with the Voting Rights Act. The black voting age population of the 6th district is 21.5%. The reason that percentage is not higher is because in 2011, Republicans moved a large number of African Americans who live on the north side of Baton Rouge into the heavily Democratic 2nd. The result was an extremely packed majority-minority district that reaches New Orleans and looks almost surrounded by a very oddly shaped and disfigured district. Next one here is Western Maryland, and we're not going to read a lot of these. Let's just go through them here. You have your example of in Houston with suburban Houston with their very small snake-like shaped from here up to here, technically continuous, but not by much, and then up to here, more of the snake-like structure. You have Austin in Texas. You have Metro Atlanta. You have Northwestern Ohio. Oh, this is a bad one. Northwestern Ohio is a bad one. You got your one district from here, and it goes all the way across the state in very block-like structures that kind of connect, or like trying to figure out your 1/3 puzzle piece. This one actually does look like a puzzle. That's funny. Oops, I can't drink with the cap on. You have Metro Detroit, you have Chicago, you have North Carolina campus, that's it. So you have just some basic examples through there. Yeah, I know, that's pretty funny. Alright, let's look at some worst partisans of the U.S. legislators. So this is going to get a little bit scientific-y through journals. I try not to have too many scientific journals when looking at these things, but I am trying to learn kind of the major purpose of why gerrymandering ultimately exists and the types of gerrymandering that happens here in politics. So we're going to skip around a little bit and find the executive summary we'll read, and then we'll go down to some of the research done by this study. Oops. Okay, here's the executive summary. The worst U.S. state legislative partisan gerrymanders are following: Virginia, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, North Carolina, Ohio, Nevada, Arkansas, and Oklahoma are tied at 8th, Kentucky and Tennessee rounding out at 10. These states were classified as the worst U.S. state legislative partisan gerrymanders based on an analysis of the statewide popular vote in 2017 or 2018 state legislative elections and the partisan composition of the state legislative chambers in 2019. Criteria used to establish the worst gerrymandering state required that the state required that the state legislative lines were drawn by the state legislature or by a bipartisan leading politician committee. The other criteria asserted if the states had 1. Minority rule in the state legislatures, 2. Extremely disproportional outcomes, where the popular vote was less than 59.9% total for one party, yet the party in power yielded more than a 15% more than 15 percentage points more in legislative seats following the 2018 elections. Or 3, both minority rule and extremely disproportional popular vote seats outcomes. And Eat Noodle says Oklahoma is a shit fest, and yes, they are. And we're going to look at Texas because I do live in Texas, and Texas has Texas has some really creative districts, so it's just kind of funny to look at. And ultimately, when you start talking about redistricting in the United States or gerrymandering in the United States, people often are like, well, look at Texas, because Texas has been historically Republican, and Republicans are mostly the ones that get blamed for gerrymandering. But as we're going to learn a little bit later, both sides do gerrymandering, and especially on the last articles where we looked at some of the maps, half of those maps were were Democratic colors and not Republican colors. So don't be stupid and say that one side does it more than the other. Both sides definitely do it because it's politically smart to do so. But we'll read a little bit more of their executive summary here. 59 million Americans live under minority rule in the U.S. state legislatures following the 2018 elections. Minority rule is defined as departing with the minority of votes in the most recent election, nevertheless controlling the majority of seats in the state legislative subsequent to the election. 6 U.S. state legislators were drawn by legislators or partisan leading commissions that resulted in a majority rule following the 2018 elections. These states are Michigan, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Wisconsin. Partisan redistricting is not limited to those states identified in the top 10 worst partisan gerrymanders. These are simply the most egregious examples in criteria 2019 drawn by the legislators or partisan leading committees earlier in the decade. These data and analysis are new and have never been presented. Most work classifying partisan redistricting has examined congressional districts, data for all U.S. state legislators for the percentage of statewide popular vote for each party and the percentage of seats for each party are presented in the report's appendix. So we're going to go back up and view, I went too far, and view the states that they mentioned were their worst again. So you have Virginia, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, North Carolina, Ohio, Nevada, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Kentucky, and Tennessee. So just off of your general knowledge of those states, and I guess you could say the breakdown of those states, you now know that there are Republican states in there and Democrat states in there. So once again, it goes back to what I was saying, that you can't ultimately be fooled by one particular party doing it more than the other, because both parties do it. We're going to go down and look at some of their data here. I want to say it was starting here. We'll start here. The governing party of these partisan gerrymandered legislators has significant control of the legislative rules and public policy outcomes, yet received less than 50% of the vote from those citizens who chose to turn out in 2018. In all 5 of these states, Democratic candidates for State House received a majority of the statewide popular vote. Because of the way that district lines were drawn in states, the Republican Party won more seats than the Democrats. There were no state houses where the Republican Party received a majority of the vote in 2018. But where the Democratic Party won the majority of the legislative seats. So you have their little table here where it has the states Virginia, with 44.5% of the statewide popular vote for the governing party, that means the existing party that's already there. And then you have the party seats in the House as a statistic later. So essentially, it's basically saying that they didn't have the majority of the popular vote, yet they ended up winning the House seat after 2018, and the district was redrawn. But let's read a little bit more about their data results from Table 1 here. As shown in Table 1, the difference between the vote of the majority and the legislative seat outcomes are striking. Of all the states in the county, Virginia is the state with the lowest population vote share for the party, 44.5%, that won the majority of seats in 51%. Just after Virginia is Wisconsin, which had one of the worst extreme partisan gerrymanders for its state house. In Wisconsin, only 44.7% of the state voters chose a Republican in 2018 state house elections, yet the Republican Party won a whopping 64.6% of the House seats. Both the Virginia and Wisconsin plans were drawn earlier by Republican-controlled state legislators. A federal court in January 2019 put a place in a new map for the 2019 Virginia state legislative elections. Well, we'll go down a little bit later in this article to the next table here. Come on, you can load. Table 2 is the minority rule in U.S. state legislative upper chambers. So once again, you have your lower and upper chambers of the legislative process. And they both mean different things and do different things depending on the state regulations. In North Carolina and Michigan, the state Senate elections revealed minority rule, as shown in Table 2. A minority of these state voters chose Republican candidates for the state Senate in 2018, but the Republican state Senate candidates won over 50% of the elections. In Pennsylvania, similarly, 45.5% of the vote went to the party that won 52% of the seats. Three of these states have minority rule for both their state houses and their senates, based on the 2018 elections. When we consider minority rule in the state house and state senate plans together, 6 states have a minority rule in one of both of their legislative chambers, thanks to the partisan calculations made by legislative map makers. In Michigan, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Wisconsin, the total population of these is 59.2 million people. This means that nearly 60 million Americans live under minority rule in U.S. state legislatures following the 2018 election. And once again, there was a court case that demanded that states have a majority-minority district, and most of the time these majority-minority districts are a little bit snake-like and fishy-like, and sometimes they're even created to, to make the minority vote not matter as much, or try to group all the minorities together to have a mass minority district, but ultimately that leads to many problems because one, let's just say Asian on the south side of the state may not believe what the Asian on the north side of the state believes or have the same sort of results. And it can go both directions. There are several examples of states following that order good, but there are also examples of following that order and being a little bit fishy with the results that they found. So we're going to look at Texas here because I wanted to see some examples for the particular outcomes in Texas. Texas. A 7-year legal battle over Texas legislative maps largely ended in May when the Supreme Court rejected almost all claims that Republican lawmakers in a state had drawn electoral districts to initially dilute minority voters in influence, otherwise known as racial gerrymandering. The decision in Abbott versus Perez rounds out a string of defeats at high court this term for voting rights advocates. Abbott is the governor of Texas, Greg Abbott. those who didn't necessarily know that. And as I said earlier, the governor in Texas has a lot of control, more than many other states, and how much control and power the governor has. A month before that ruling, the Supreme Court asserted that partisan gerrymandering should be left to the states. In a 5-4 decision along traditional conservative liberal ideology lines, the Supreme Court ruled that the Supreme Court ruled that the partisan redistricting is a political question not revisable by federal courts. Again, we're going back to the decision and what I said at the very beginning. Despite gerrymandering being kind of obvious in a lot of examples through like the snake-like structures and districts not being compact, because most of the time districts are continuous, like the snake pattern, but aren't ultimately box-shaped, are a district that looks compact as much as possible. But as I said at the very beginning of this episode, the Supreme Court could not determine a legal definition for what gerrymandering was. Therefore, it's ultimately left up to the governments and a political interpretation to define what gerrymandering is. And because of that, gerrymandering is still going to be done and isn't ultimately answered as a political question. Eat Doodle says racial gerrymandering is unconstitutional, and yes, it is unconstitutional, and is something that states that do it, are suspected to do it, do need to be held accountable, because especially the history that some of the southern states have, you want to make sure that minority groups are not targeted and are treated fairly. And redistricting is one of those ways that a political system could target a certain population group or a certain minority group. So you do have to make sure that the states are being fair, and especially states that may have a history of being unfair to the minority groups. And it is in the Constitution and in the Voting Rights Act and in several other Supreme Court cases that they can't do certain things when it comes to redistricting, even though they can't ultimately define what gerrymandering is in that last court case that was previously mentioned there. But yeah, I think everybody kind of knows that, and that's why some people get a little bit annoyed when they kind of see something that may look a little bit suspicious, but the Supreme Court didn't do anything about it, or other people didn't do anything about it. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote for the conservative majority that excessive partisanship and the drawing of districts does lead to results that reasonably seem unjust, but he said that does not mean it is the court's responsibility to find a solution. Gerrymandering refers to the practice of, we already know that, the compactness of a district, a measure of how irregular its shape is, as determined by the ratio of the area of the district to the area of the circle with the same perimeter, can serve as a useful proxy for how gerrymandered the district is. Districts that follow a generally regular shape tend to be compact, while those that have a lot of squiggles and offshoots and tentacle-looking protrusions tend to be the most decored. So you kind of see a map of Texas here in most of their districts, and a lot of them do seem to be pretty square-shaped type of districts, and nothing looks particularly too suspicious when you look at a major map of Texas, but there are several individual examples, and this article was very in-depth to the particular example of Texas, and it is linked in my YouTube channel or on my Discord server if you want to look up any of these articles for yourself. But we're going to go to our next thing here about how Texas might redraw its maps in 2021 after having the census data from 2020. When the census results are released next spring, Texas is expected to gain as many as 3 new congressional seats. Redrawing the district maps for the U.S. House of Representatives, as well as the state legislature and the state board of education, will be one of the major tasks Texas lawmakers face next session. But how does it work? To draw useful maps, legislators need to know who lives where, information that's just being analyzed by the U.S. Census Bureau. The statutory deadline for its release of the census is March 31st, said Jeff Archer, executive director of the Texas Legislative Council, a nonpartisan research agency that assists lawmakers in redistricting. For redistricting, you need to know two things. You need to know the census, and you need to have a system to use the census to draw the districts. The system Texas lawmakers use is unique software known as Red Apple, short for redistricting application. Texas was one of the few states that still uses its own custom software. The bigger the state, the more likely they are to use their own. California or Texas or New York, then a smaller state that is more likely to use off-the-shelf software that has a lot less data, a lot fewer issues, Archer said. Texas has used some version of Red Apple since 1990s. Archer said the only major change in the program since then is that it has become faster and smoother in its operations. The U.S. Census Bureau website currently is projecting the release of the census data will be around April 1st, at least a day late. But once the data becomes available, any state lawmakers can input the data into Red Apple and start to draw maps. If you want a district that has 1,000 people in it, Archer said, you basically open the system to the part of the state you want to draw your district in, and then you start selecting units of geography, basically coming them together into a blob. If you will, into a district, it will automatically accumulate all the data for all the blocks, the census data. That's a very oddly worded sentence, or quote. The legislative traditional makes it available through the members, so a citizen can impact their member if they want to work on a district, but our system is designed to work only in the Capitol complex. There's a lot of security involved, so on. He said lots of member sponsor groups our work with, MALDEF, are the Republican Party and their officers in district line. Our hopes when it comes to Texas redistricting is simply that we will have maps that respect communities' interests, that keep cities and county populations together, that will be able to send back a healthy delegation to the United States House in 2023. After these lines are drawn, we hold elections on them in 2022, and that Texas will be a big part in helping Republicans take back the U.S. House in 2022. It goes on to talk a little bit more, but we aren't ultimately interested in hearing about that. I just thought it was interesting that Texas used that sort of programming for drawing the district lines. But it does make a lot of sense, because if you had to do all of this by hand, I feel like it would get very complicated very fast. So we have here just some general examples of gerrymandering and taxes on Google Images. And I'm just going to kind of scroll down here just to give a general basic outline of some examples. And Austin is one of the big ones, because there's a district that goes all the way from in Austin to San Antonio. And anybody that knows Austin and knows San Antonio knows that those people drastically think different. So the idea that they would share the same voters or share the same interests doesn't make any sense at all. And then we just have some examples here in California, as well as some of the worst redistricting out there, or gerrymandered districts out there from Google Images here. And every state has their own examples, with some states being worse off than others. So it's pretty stupid to say that one state maybe has more than the other, because all states ultimately do have some form of gerrymandering that has existed or is existing now when it comes to their district lines. But I thought we'd kind of break up all of that data that we just read and go to this video. And this video is very biased in its way, because it is by Vox. But I just thought we would kind of break up and watch a little bit of it before we start reading a little bit more of some data and results based off of the election.
Voted for who would represent them in Congress. But in North Carolina, the election results were really weird. These squares represent all the voters in North Carolina. They were voting for these 13 seats in Congress. About half voted for Republicans, and about 48% voted for Democrats. So you might think, of the 13 congressional seats, maybe Democrats would have won 6 seats, and Republicans would have won 7. But no, Democrats only won 3 of 13 seats, way less than half. This imbalance was because North Carolina's congressional districts had been gerrymandered. It means that these voters had been grouped into districts very strategically with the goal of benefiting one party. Gerrymandering has pretty much always happened in America. That's because every 10 years, the political districts are redrawn.
It's every 12 years, at a bare minimum, not every 10 years. So he does have that fact at least wrong from a Supreme Court standpoint, because they did do a case that said that you had to at least redistrict your lines once every 12 years. But I don't think that's ultimately too big of a concern, because really every state redistricts their lines more than once every 12 years. So even that Supreme Court case alone doesn't really have that much meaning to it. And as I said before, Vox is definitely going to go more towards a Republican-leaning gerrymandering strategy, but it is important to know that there's not one party that has done it more than others, and every party in every state has had a gerrymandered district and probably does have a gerrymandered district right now. So I want to make that very clear, because oftentimes when you start hearing about gerrymandering, it comes down to one party, and that's usually the Republican Party, because I do think that they're a little bit more obvious about it because of their states, such as Texas being so big, and California is a little bit more subtle than Texas, because Texas, some of their districts are a little bit wacky. But I just wanted to kind of point that out before we move on a little bit.
And in most cases, those new lines get drawn by whoever holds power in state government at the time. That's what happened in 2010. Republicans won control of lots of state governments and redrew the political lines to favor them.
One other thing. Right now, the legislator, and this is why when you start hearing people talk about how many legislators there are, right now the majority of legislators are Republicans. So that is why a lot of people, political strategists, or people that follow politics, are thinking that in 2022, being the midterms, the House could very easily flip to a Republican majority, because if you follow politics, you know that most of the time when a party has full control over the presidency, the Senate, and the House, one of the House or the Senate, usually the House, flips a party, because having the full control, people want there to be a scale and want there to be a balance. So because they want there to be a balance, you start to see a shift within the political party and who represents the majority in the House. But right now, the majority of legislators are Republican, and there's a lot of Republican states are suspected to gain House seats. So the idea that that could shift is looking very likely.
Themselves. And over the next few years, redistricting helped them hold on to almost all those states. This shifted the balance of power. And it turns out behind a lot of this was one guy.
Usually the voters get to pick the politicians. In redistricting, the politicians get to pick the voters.
This is Thomas Hofeller, the mapmaker who helped Republicans gerrymander districts over the last decade. When Hofeller died in 2018, his daughter found thousands of his emails and files, which she shared with activists. The files show that Tom Hofeller's fingerprints are all over the way America's political maps look today. But North Carolina was his masterpiece. And if you want to understand why gerrymandering is such a big problem in the US, that's a good place to start. The basics of gerrymandering are actually pretty simple. If you're a Republican trying to keep power, you want to do two things. First, pack as many Democratic voters as possible into a single district. If you have a district where almost everyone votes Democrat, that means almost half these votes are basically wasted.
Once again, both parties do it.
You can also crack big Democratic areas into separate districts where there are slightly more Republicans. So even though an area has a lot of Democratic votes, they would actually lose in this district and in this district. These are the two elements of classic gerrymandering, packing and cracking. And Hofeller employed these techniques masterfully in North Carolina. In 2011, he was hired to redraw the state's political lines, and for congressional districts, he came up with this map. Now I just want to focus in on District 12, this weird skinny shape. In order to make sense of this shape, we have to look at another map. This map shows the percentage of black people in each neighborhood. The bluer areas are where more black people live. Hoffler basically gathered up black people in Winston-Salem, Greensboro, and Charlotte and packed them into one district. So that's how District 12 happened. Hoffler also did this with North Carolina state representatives and state senators.
Hello, our board Doom. Hopefully you're liking what you're watching so far. Just wanted to welcome you in, and if you have any questions, definitely feel free to ask or anything, or your opinion on gerrymandering. And as I was saying earlier, both parties do this, but we definitely know that we're getting a certain perspective from Vox because they do have their leftist viewpoints, and not that that's ultimately a bad thing. That is just something to pay attention to whenever you're getting your media for. And really, you should do that for any article you ultimately read or any video you read. You shouldn't ultimately take everything what you hear as being fully true or anything. But I thought I gave a very good points, very good perspectives on the particular state and how gerrymandering particularly works. Because most of the time when you see these snake-like structures, that is ultimately an example of a gerrymandered district.
For example, here are the state senate districts. Here, he packed Winston-Salem into one district, and then packed Greensboro into its own district. These new districts help Republicans get a stranglehold on power in the North Carolina State House. And over the next few years, they were able to pass crucial legislation.
A strict new voter ID law in North Carolina.
Which bathrooms transgender individuals can use in North Carolina?
I don't know why you're going to these examples. That's what I hate when videos do this, where they start talking about one issue and then they go to the next issue. I hate when videos do that.
Federal courts ruled that both of these maps were unconstitutional. They said what North Carolina Republicans did wasn't just gerrymandering, it was racial gerrymandering, done to deliberately dilute the political power of black people. The court said the Republicans in the North Carolina State House now had to redraw the lines without looking at racial demographics. So, they went back to Tom Hoffler. This time, Hoffler couldn't look at race. Instead, he looked at which areas voted for Democrats and which areas voted for Republicans. Instead of a racial gerrymander, it would be a partisan gerrymander. Here's that map, using data from 2014. The bluer an area, the more Democratic voters there are. Now, if you zoom in here to Greensboro, you can see one of the highest concentrations of Democratic voters in the state. Hoffler drew a congressional district line to crack this community in half. This meant Democrats here were now in the minority in their district, and Democrats here were also in the minority in their district. Hoffler...
As I said earlier, that makes total sense if you want to purely make sure that your party wins. And it's just kind of a weird concept, because even if you take politics at its bare minimum, you would think that just because of human nature, as I said before, you would want to redraw districts to make sure that your party wins. And the strategy of cracking, as they're mentioning here, is a very good way to divide high majority party voters or opposite party voters and make sure that they're split enough to not allow the majority to influence the election and have your candidate win. It just makes a lot of sense. But we'll continue on with their example here.
Hoffler employed these techniques all over the state to create North Carolina's new political districts. And the first big test for these new maps would be the 2018 election. Democrats were expected to turn out in droves.
Democrats are vying for a potential blue...
Boris says here, I've seen Gavin McInnes' opinion of Vox, and I'm not seeing where his opinion of them is wrong so far. I'm not sure I exactly understand what you're meaning so far. I know that Galvin McInnes is definitely not somebody that would agree with Vox very often. He's probably pretty right compared to Vox. But I'm not necessarily saying that Vox's analysis is wrong about what they're talking about. They actually are right. There are definitely examples that they are pointing out and examples that we should be paying attention to. But I'm just saying that you can't ultimately come away thinking that only the Republican Party or only these examples of gerrymandering exist. There are many more examples of gerrymandering that exist. So to think that just one party does it is rather silly. And after going away from this video, you would think that only one party does it. So I just want to make sure I point that out.
Wait.
Oops.
The wave that Republicans fear is going to wipe them out.
So, how do the maps do? For state representatives, Democrats got 51% of the vote. They only won 46% of seats. For state senate, they received half the vote and won just 42% of seats. And for Congress, you already know how that one turned out. Democrats won nearly half the votes, but won only 3 out of 13 seats. A year later in 2019, the Supreme Court weighed in. They said it was beyond their reach, that it wasn't their job to fix it. All of this raised...
That's once again what we talked about, where the case went to the Supreme Court and they said that they couldn't put a legal definition, yet they kind of know what gerrymandering is and what it kind of is. Basically, you can look at a map and see the snake-like district or a very oddly shaped district and say there's something fishy there, but we can't put a legal definition about gerrymandering, and that's why it's become such a complex system and why it is still going to be used in future elections and ultimately this next midterm election cycle once the census data is in. Many states are going to be redistricting based off of this census data, including Texas is where I live, and the legislature has a lot of power in determining here in Texas how districts are going to look.
Raised an existential question. If Republicans could continue drawing the lines to stay in power, how could they ever be elected out of office? But the Supreme Court's ruling left open the possibility for state courts to rule on partisan gerrymandering. And in September 2019, that's exactly what North Carolina's Supreme Court did. The court found that partisan gerrymandering violated the state constitution. In the court's decision, it was Hoffler's files that helped prove that North Carolina Republicans drew these lines with the clear intention of benefiting themselves. Ultimately, the court said North Carolina Republicans had to redraw the state House and state Senate maps one more time. This new map, approved by North Carolina legislators, is much less biased toward one party, even though it took some extreme measures and nearly a decade to force politicians to draw a fair map. In the last few years, the courts in several states, like Florida and Pennsylvania, have made partisan gerrymandering much harder. And now that's also the case in North Carolina. Hoffler is gone now, but in other states across the country, many maps he helped draw are still in use. And while there's now a clearer strategy to challenge those maps in state courts, many voters are still effectively not choosing their representatives. It's like Hoffler said, the representatives are choosing the voters.
Of course, redistricting is democracy at work. Redistricting is like an election in reverse. It's a great event.
So once again, I thought the video Fox did there was a very good representation of what we could ultimately expect from gerrymandering and potentially what could happen in the worst examples or the worst types of gerrymandering in whatever state you may ultimately live in, and show the motivations kind of behind what types of gerrymandering there are, either through racial or party gerrymandering types, I guess you would say. And I guess I would generally ask anybody who's watching now, Boar, Noodles, or whoever else may be viewing, what your general thoughts are on gerrymandering and your general thoughts about what you expect. Do you think that your vote ultimately matters when it comes to your district and wherever you may live in? Because we talked about very early on in today's episode where I believe it was Emma, if I remember right, was basically saying that she felt like her vote didn't really matter that much, and she didn't necessarily give a particular reason for why she didn't think that, but I do think it could ultimately come to gerrymandering and just how partisan politics is today. But I wanted to quickly talk about the last point that the Vox video was mentioning, and that being the fact of the idea that I just lost my train of thought. The idea that when you go to vote, it doesn't ultimately matter because it's already chosen for you. So basically, if you live in one of these like snake-like districts, The idea that when you go to vote for your local elections that ultimately maybe even matter more than the president, it may not matter because the legislator of your state decided to draw a district that is going to make sure that your party or their party or whatever the legislator is going to win. And if you're the opposite party of that candidate, then ultimately your vote doesn't matter at all. And that is a very sad world we live in. And when we listen to the TED Education video, it basically mentioned that before you go to vote, you should ultimately look at your shape of your district and how it looks. And if you were to look at your district and see a snake-like structure, or see a district that's not compact, but maybe continuous through a snake, you would say, well, if I go to vote and I am a Republican and it's a Democratic district, then I know that my vote's not going to matter. And that's just a very sad concept. And I see Noodles has a vote tally thing next to a shredder. I think that's a shredder. So I see that you don't think your vote matters very much either, Eat Noodles, and that's interesting. But I ultimately think I'm starting to become a little bit more, I guess you would call it black-pilled, when it comes to politics, and thinking that ultimately the way politics is working is looking more and more depressing than optimistic or anything like that. We'll go to our next evaluation here, and this is by Science Direct and a electoral study or journal. It states evaluating partisan gains from congressional gerrymandering using computer simulations to estimate the effect of gerrymandering in the U.S. House. I'll read what Bohr says first before we get into this article. Sure, I get it. Everyone has their own perspective, and neither side is squeaky clean about getting what they want. But then that's why I am independent, soon to be Patriot Party when it gets off the ground. Yes, districts always matter to reps and Dems, or Republicans and Dems. Yes, of course, I definitely get that for sure, Bohr. I don't know too much about the Patriot Party and their particular policies or viewpoints, so I would have to educate myself more on that to understand the exact, what the party stands for. But as I've told people many times before when they ask you on Twitch or whatever else what my party is, I ultimately say that I was pretty conservative, and now I'm much more libertarian-minded than anything else. I'm probably libertarian but lean conservative is kind of where I stand right now, meaning that I think that ultimately the government should be a lot more smaller and give more freedoms to the American people and be... I still think there needs to be some form of government, but the way the government controls us is ultimately, I think, the problem in what's leading to our politics here today. But we'll read what their abstract has to say about the results. What is the effect of gerrymandering on the partisan outcomes of the United States congressional elections? A major challenge to answering this question is in determining the outcomes that would have resulted in the absence of gerrymandering. Since we only observe congressional elections where the districts have potentially been gerrymandered, we lack a non-gerrymandered counterfactual that would allow us to isolate its true effect. To overcome this challenge, we conduct computer simulations of the distracting process to withdraw the boundaries of congressional districts within partisan intent. By eliminating the outcomes of these non-gerrymandered districts, we are able to establish the non-gerrymandered counterfactual against which the actual outcomes can be compared. The analysis reveals that while Republicans and Democrats gerrymandered affects the partisan outcomes of congressional elections, in some states the net effect across the state is modest, creating no more than one new Republican seat in Congress. Therefore, the partisan composition of Congress can mostly be explained by nonpartisan distracting or districting. Suggestions that much of the electoral bias in congressional elections is caused by factors other than partisan intent and the districting process. And we're going to look at some of their figures here, if they'll ever show up. We'll go here. No, stop. Sorry about that. It worked earlier. Well, that's fun. Well, it's not wanting to pull up. I was going to try to pull up some of the examples here and data they found, but they're not wanting to show up, even though they showed up earlier. But basically, they just showed some of their data and results from where they were analyzing and from. And as you read from their abstract or kind of conclusion to the article for the scientific journal, there are some instances where gerrymandering exists, but it doesn't really have too much of a major impact as compared to the other examples or whatnot. And Boris says here, Patriot Party will be very libertarian-minded, constitutional based. Trump was never a real Republican. It was just his way in. So, are you saying the Patriot Party would be Trump's party, or are you just saying it's a different type of party? Because I have heard many people think about the idea that Trump would start his own party and maybe call it the Patriot Party or the MAGA Party or something like that. Oh, you're talking about that. Okay. So, yeah, if Trump were to do that, that's a very interesting claim or very interesting idea, because I've talked about this on many streams before. I've asked my co-host Anna Voltes on a show we do on Thursday called Getting the Answers, where we talked about numerous amounts of things. I asked him on one show before the Capitol riots about which party he thought was more easily fractured, like which party he thought was weaker and more likely to break up into other parties. And we both kind of thought it was the Democratic Party because of the progressive wing that the Democratic Party has through AOC, the Squad, Bernie Sanders for the most part. You know, you have those very progressive type of candidates. And I was thinking that they were really, and they're very loud, they're very vocal. So the idea that they would break up and start their own party that's kind of towards the college students and young voters and free education, you know, no debt, you know, those type of policies might make a lot of sense. So we both kind of thought that party was a little bit more fractured and more likely to break apart. But after the Capitol riots and after what happened with Trump in the election and whatnot, the idea that the Republican Party could be more fractured than the Democratic Party is looking to be more and more likely. Because as you just said, Trump never really was a Republican. If anything, he was he more looked at which party was weaker. Because I've talked to my dad before, and we both said that if Trump looked at the party and the political system and maybe we lived in like a reversed ward where the Democrats looked like the stronger party and looked like the party he could go into, Trump would have been a Democrat and won the election in the Democratic Party, because he was basically just looking for a party that he thought was more weaker and could have agreed with a little bit more, because Trump really wasn't a full-on Republican like many other people who serve in the Republican Party, like let's say Ted Cruz or Lindsey Graham or people like that. So I do think that the Republican Party could potentially be more fractured. Boris says, I would say both are equally fragile for different reasons, and I would definitely agree with you there. And I kind of explained the biggest reasons I think for both parties. I don't know if one party is ultimately going to break down before the other. There could potentially be both parties deciding that they're going to fracture and start their own parties. But the way the United States politics works, usually we only operate in a two-party basis. We do have the Libertarian Party being the biggest third party out there, but the Libertarian Party doesn't really have that many percentage of voters out there, so it's still a rather weak third party that exists. So if they were to break up and devise their own Patriot Party, Trump would basically have to persuade Republicans that exist now to vote for him, and they would basically have to become the new Republican Party rather than being just a third party. Is kind of my perspective on all of that. We'll read another scientific journal here in the abstract a little bit. Partisan gerrymandering and the political process effects on roll call voting and state policies. Recent scholarship has documented advantages of new measure of partisan gerrymandering, the difference in parties' wasted voters divided by the total number of votes cast. This measure, known as efficiency gap, can be calculated directly from aggregated vote totals, facilitating comparison of the party gerrymandering across states and time. That was weird. In this article, let me go down here. Oh, thank you, Eat Noodles, for the follow. Thank you very much. That was the sound. I forgot that I had sound alerts on. Hopefully it showed up on the screen. I think I got that fixed, but I appreciate the follow very much. But we'll continue on with what I was reading here. Can be calculated dividing the aggregated vote totals, facilitating comparison of the disparity of party gerrymandering across the states and time. In this article, we conduct the first analysis of the EG's effect on legislative representation and policy making in the states. We first show that the partisan outcome of the legislative elections has important causal effects on the ideology representation of individual districts. The ideology, the composition of legislative chambers, and the conservatism of the state policy making. We can then make that version in the EGs across state years is associated with the systemic differences in the ideology location of the medium state legislator and the conservatism of state policies. These results suggest that partisan gerrymandering has major consequences not only for who wins the elections, but for the political process as a whole. So basically all that was saying there was an effect on getting people to go to vote off of people who believe they are in gerrymandered district is a lot harder to do because of people feeling like their vote doesn't necessarily matter. And that article did talk a little bit about that. And once again, that article is linked in my YouTube channel description or on my Discord server. Eat noodles. Where is the straight pride with the trans flag, LGBT flag, probably the bisexual flag, the lesbian flag? I don't know. You got a whole bunch of things there. You would have to educate me on what all the flags mean. That's funny. Okay. We'll read here the causes and consequences of gerrymandering. And I'm sorry that this is getting a lot more scientific-y here at the end of the stream. We don't have too much more to go as far as scientific journals, and then I'm going to kind of give my conclusion remarks and listen and answer your comments or anything if you have any questions or what you think about the whole concept of gerrymandering or things related to it. In recent years, scholars have made great strides in measuring the extent of partisan gerrymandering. By and large, though, they have not yet tried to answer the questions that legally or logically come next. What are those of district plans, partisan skews, and what consequences these skews have for our democratic values? Using a unique data set of state houses and congressional plans, partisan tilts from 1972 to the present, this article addresses precisely these issues. It finds that single-party control of the redistricting process dramatically benefits the party in charge, while other map-naming configurations have small and insignificant effects. It also shows that the greater black representation and greater urbanization have a modest pro-Republican impact. It concludes as well as the harm of gerrymandering is not limited to divergencies between party seats and vote shares. The injury extends rather to the distortion of the representation that legislators provide to their constituents. So we have all that there, and Eat Noodle says, it's a bunch of bullshit. Stick to what you were born with, except for this. This is a condition. Oh, okay. So he has all the flags, but that flag. Okay, that makes a little more sense. But yeah, I mean, in general, I definitely agree with that. I definitely would say that you have to at least, you can't view LGBTQ plus people as less than you. But I basically, you have to still respect people for being people and ideas and that community. But it is a very hard concept to ultimately grasp and come up with because yeah, basically in general I do agree with you. It's hard to basically have a more positive look on it, and I would have to think a little bit more of that to try to say something, but I don't want to say something that I'll regret later, so I'll just leave it there. Okay, where was I going here? This article was good. We want to go to results on page 11 here. We don't need to read all the stuff in between. I went too far. Okay. I'm terrible at this. Anyway, we'll read the last 3 paragraphs because I thought these last 3 paragraphs were rather interesting here. Elections from 1972 to 2016. These scores are computed using actual election results rather whenever districts were contested by both major parties, and using whatever races did not feature 2 majority party candidates. Negative values indicate a Republican advantage that is more Democratic than Republican. Positive values denote a Democratic edge. As noted earlier, at both the state house and congressional levels, the historical distribution of the deficiency gap is normal and centered very close to 0. At both levels, the deficiency gap has also trended in a Republican direction over the last 3 redistricting cycles. With redistricting to the potential causes of district plans, partisan skews, I compelled data on the most of the precious work. The institution responsible for redistricting is coded by a plan using 5 dummy variables: undefined Democratic control, undefined Republican control, court commission, or divided government, blah, 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 blah. We'll go down to the data results here. As we can see in the figures, and this is remarkably a little bit blurry, but you see here the left side is for the House elections, the right panel is for congressional elections. The point estimates represents the impact of the deficiency gap for adopting a particular redistricting institution or increasing a continuous variable by 1 standard deviation. The bars to the left and right of both points estimate a denote of 95% convinced intervals. Here's a question. Do you think that this is from Board. Here's a question. Do you think that the internet becoming more prevalent in life, will its influence eventually end up making gerrymandering a moot tactic? I do think that... That's a very good question. I like that question, actually. I do think that the role of the internet and how it's able to be played out is going to make gerrymandering be a much harder thing to do for legislators to get away with, because ultimately these everything is made public. And it's very easy, like the earlier TED education article our video we watched, it's very easy to simply look up whatever district you live in, and if you see that district as being a snake or that district as looking a little bit suspicious, I think it would be very easy to go in to your representative and say, look, I know what you're doing, you can't fool me, you're being stupid. I know exactly what this is. Even though the Supreme Court can't legally define gerrymandering, you know it when you see it. So to answer your question, I do think that now that the internet has made things much more public and the data still has to be released publicly, I think it's going to make gerrymandering a lot harder to get away with. So I do think that this could potentially be a dying consequence of our political system, or it's just going to continuously happen, but people are going to be much more aware about it. Because I could see both things happening. I could see people, like legislators, not really caring about people knowing that it's rigged, because ultimately all they want to do is win on either side. So I could still see gerrymandering existing, but the idea that it's going to keep happening and people aren't necessarily going to know about it doesn't really exist anymore. We're going to go down to our next chart, and it's hard to ultimately really kind of see the chart, but the blue is Democrats and the red is Republicans. So you can kind of see through the courts that Republicans tend to have a slight advantage because mostly they have more legislators. They have more legislator control. And the type of states that give the redistricting lines to the legislator, basically the legislator has more control than an independent commission district or a nonpartisan district like California. Therefore, Republican and South states are maybe more likely to have more power in the way they redistrict, and if they want to keep the redistricting and want to keep the Republican control, then they're going to do that, blah, 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 blah. So in general, you see gerrymandering and favoring Republicans maybe more because of those reasons. So that's kind of what that article was talking about there. So I'm going to take a quick drink break here, and I think that it looks like you have the same opinion on your question as well, since you said exactly there, but I would like to know your answer for that as well, because I do think that the internet, do you think that gerrymandering is still going to happen? Because you're going to start to see new district lines based off of the census that got released or is about to be released for 2021. So basically my question to you is, do you think that after all the census data is done and everything's calculated and now we have new districts, do you think there's still going to be examples out there of states that did gerrymandering for whatever reason? The impact of gerrymandering visualized. After the 2012 elections, Democrats were outraged by the gerrymandering congressional map, and with good reason. They had won the national popular vote by 2.5 million votes, once you account for uncontested races, but lost the House 234 to 201. In the wake of 2018 midterms, there hasn't been as much outrage because Democrats managed to win the House despite the map. Some of the right have gone so far as to say that the congressional map votes was, in fact, this election because Democrats' share of seats approximately equaled their share of votes. This argument is deeply misleading. The congressional map remains plenty biased against Democrats. In 2018, the party won 235 seats with a 6.7% margin in the popular vote. Republicans could have won 235 seats with a popular vote of just 1.1%. The following graph shows how the 2018 election could have gone under various population vote scenarios to model a popular tie 0% margin, for example. I applied a uniform swing that shifted each district to Republicans by 6.7%. There were 204 districts that voted for Democrats by more than 6.7%, and Democrats would have held those under a popular vote tie. The other 231 would have gone to Republicans. So you see a general map out here of the Senate majority, and this is referring to 2018 election. And I see my friend Scott's here joined. Thank you for stopping by there. And he's got a whole big block we'll read here. How so? We already have these as public record. The problem, information cost is still too high. People will rely on IQs to change his tactics. Besides, I doubt that the majority of people in any given state will be against gerrymandering for the majority party because people voted in that majority. So I doubt you will see people talking to the streets to change that. I would argue most people are satisfied with. Majority likes to keep their power more, and there is more flexible towards issues that will benefit them. And then Scott says, yeah, sorry about that essay. No, you're fine. I appreciate it. It's good to get different people's opinions on everything. And by the way, if you want to follow a political streamer as well on Twitch, you can definitely follow Scott's. I highly recommend that, especially if you want intellectual content and not so much random stuff that a lot of political streamers tend to talk about. But in general, I do agree with what you are saying there. As well, Scott's, because we talked about a little bit earlier that ultimately people just simply want to have control when it comes to politics. So no matter who you are, the majority state legislator is basically going to have is going to want to keep their power. Like, that's the whole point of politics. And we were talked about a little bit earlier through Boris' question about if he thought the internet would make it a little bit harder to gerrymander itself. And I think that it's going to make it a little bit more obvious, but politics still has the same issue of education and people who view politics. And what I mean by that is basically people who follow politics and are passionate about politics think they know about politics, or at least read about politics by any means, are going to know about gerrymandering and the concept of it and know that it's bad and they want it to stop, they want it to be more fair, blah, 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 blah. But still, the mass majority of people who don't really like to follow politics, find politics annoying, find politics frustrating, whatever word you want to use, are still going to not necessarily know about gerrymandering and the effect it has. So in other words, in order for something like gerrymandering to ultimately change, it would take the massive amount of people recognizing that it exists and wanting it to change. So the pressure would have to be so high for the legislator of that state to decide to draw districts completely fair. In other words, every person would have to go through their local elections to vote for these representatives that are in your legislators and say, if you decide to draw a bad district, we will make sure that you are not voted again. And right now, that just doesn't exist. And that could be because of several reasons. It could be because of incumbent bias that does exist especially in American politics, pretty badly. And also, it also has to change the way people view politics in general, as I was explaining earlier, because a lot of times local politics and local elections matter even more than the president. Yes, the president has the power to do something through the executive order or do some mass control thing and pass something that affects you maybe more in your industry, but ultimately your local government, your local politics, the local things, your local bills, your local resolutions are the things that matter for your particular state and your particular community. So until people start voting more at the local base or local places and local politics, that's the only way change in gerrymandering and change in politics is going to happen for the better, is ultimately what I kind of argue when we start talking about that. Scott also says here, majorities are incentivized to maintain their control. Also, yes, you just described the issue with information cost exactly. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's kind of what we talked about that a little bit earlier as well. And even Bohr was kind of mentioning that as well. Even though I think, anyway, I'll read a little bit more of the article and what they have to say about the 2018 election. That shape is from the winner-take-all districts because we have winner-take-all districts. A slight edge in the national vote total can translate into big edge in seats. The winning party wins a lot of close elections, but the winner-take-all doesn't have to be unfair to one side or the other. In the graph above, if the party lines were on top of each other, it would mean that each party wins the same number of seats at each percentage of the national vote. The gap between the lines is the distortion attribute to the map. And excuse me for my horrible reading, but we'll continue on. Democrat voters are packed into heavily Democratic districts, so they are guaranteed a larger base. If the Republican won overwhelmingly within the national popular vote, 75% to 25%, they would still lose 34 seats. These 34 seats are Democratic based. The 34 districts are in cities, including 9 in New York City alone, and 31 of the 34 are majority minority, and that is also what we were talking about a little bit earlier in the stream, and Scott's may be able to define it a little bit better than I am about what majority minority is. But there are several suspicious things that happen with majority minority districts, such as in Louisiana, where they had one person from the south side of the state all the way up to the north side of the state being in the same district. And the idea that the people from the south of the state and the north of the state are going to believe in the same things just because they are black or just because they are Latino doesn't really make so much sense. And a lot of people were blaming Louisiana for that particular majority minority district. So the concept that the Supreme Court made people have to have majority minority seemed good, but the majority minority districts can still be drawn wrong, as we saw in that example of Louisiana. Eat Noodle says here, what is your opinion on Nintendo Switch portrait mode? It might be a little too political. Well, I can tell you what, Noodles, I don't have a Nintendo Switch, and I don't really have a friend that has a Nintendo Switch, and I don't really play very many video games myself, so I don't think I could answer that question for you. I'm sorry about that. And besides that question, I can't answer that question. I'll get the TOS coming after me on that one. You got to watch out for that. Boris says here, it makes me wonder what is going to happen to the districts in New York, Massachusetts, and Cincinnati, where they are hemorrhaging people. I think I said that right. Anyway, which would be more adventurous, a full district in favor of an empty district against it. What? Let me read that again. District and hemorrhaging people, which would be more advantageous, a full district in your favor or an empty district against it. I'm not sure I understand what you mean by empty district against that. If you maybe explain what you mean by empty district against it, I might be able to answer your question. I think I know what you're saying, but I don't want to misspeak. So you would have to define that term for me to answer that question. Eat Noodle says, where are you currently residing? I am in Texas, and a small city of Lufkin, or near Lufkin, really. It's even smaller where I technically am, but the biggest city next to me is Lufkin. And ironically, the person that represents Lufkin and Nacogdoches and a few other counties next to me is the person who's going to be the head of the redistricting committee for the legislature in Texas. So that's kind of funny as well. We would have a report of 2012, and Democrats had again won by 2%. Democrats need to win by 2.7% to get necessary 218 seats for a majority. Republicans can get 3 if they lose the popular vote 7% or less. I modeled a typical election based off the results of this election and the 15th before it. In the typical election held with this map and these voter patterns, Republicans would need a 2.6 percentage points fewer votes to get the same number of seats. So a 2.6% of the electoral votes for Democrats, only to have their votes canceled out by the map. Wanted by followers, primes, and viewers. https click.ru.rg.gqv, big followers. Thank you. I'll definitely buy some followers. That is hilarious. I love when these bots decide to come on by. Makes the stream so much more fun. We're going to ban that real quick. Alrighty, there we go. Yeah, you gotta love when the bots decide to come through with their message. It makes things much more adventurous. But we'll continue on. I would call those wasted votes. Oh, he answered. Typically, only people with enough income can move, so poor districts would keep their numbers, making it a classism balancing act. Okay, I think I understand what you're saying now. So you're saying for minority groups, would you rather have a full district in your favor, or would you rather have... Okay, I get what you're saying, I think. And you can definitely comment if you think I'm misinterpreting your question here. But basically, what I think you're asking is, as a minority member, so let's just say, as a minority member, would you rather be a part of a big district that represents you and your people, or would you rather be broken apart and maybe not have your vote ultimately matter as much, or a candidate that you favor not matter? And that's the whole concept of kind of the majority-minority districts out there, and the Supreme Court mandating that you have to have a majority-minority district. So if you were somebody who is of a minority community, I would think, it's hard to say ultimately for sure, but I would think you would want to have a candidate that favors your position more than having to be broken apart and never having the candidate that favors your position. So I can kind of see that perspective, but it's hard to say for certain what you would ultimately prefer. But I think it would ultimately come down to, I would rather have a district that gets a candidate that I like passed more often than a district that doesn't get the candidate I like passed less often because of the way the district is drawn, being a minority person or a person of color. So I think I understood your question there. And basically, if I had to answer your question in a simple way, I would say that I think I would rather have a mass majority minority district than having to be broken apart and never having my vote ultimately count. Gerrymandering or geography. So far as I haven't said anything about whether this gap is driven by gerrymandering, Republicans drawing districts that pick Democrats together, or geographically Democrats live around other Democrats. Both of those could explain why swing districts lean Republican. To answer this question, we need to know what a non-gerrymandered map would look like, but how do you define that? Dave at 538 drew hypothetical congressional maps by following a few different rules. One rule was to make districts as compact as possible. That results in a hilarious-looking circular districts. Another more plausible rule was to make districts as compact as possible while trying to follow county borders. Here's Ohio as an example. I don't know why I always do that. I always have to look at those names a couple times, and I always say it wrong if I just glance over it. But anyway, so that once again, it comes back to the idea of the two districts or two district types that you have to do, with a district being compact and continuous. So because good districts meet both, you have districts that, as they put it here, may look like circular patterns or look a little bit weird. But ultimately, if you follow a perfect political system or a perfect political idea, that would be better than simply doing a district that looks like a snake or anything like that. So you see your map here and you see your certain districts. Bohr says, I see that a Haya. Yeah, I always have to look at it twice. I always go like, oh, wait a second. I read that wrong. Every single time. I think I count that as for my dyslexia there, definitely. And I also have noticed recently, just to not go too much on a side tangent, when I start writing, I'll flip letters all the time. So I'll write a word like, let's just say that, and it's TH, and then I would put T, and I'll be like, wait a second, no, it's THA. So I keep flipping them all the time in how I write. And hello, Hilda, welcome for stopping by. Hopefully you had fun with your Star Valley, I think it's called, if I'm remembering right. It always looks like a pretty fun game. And we're just talking about gerrymandering, and you also live in Canada, if I remember right. And Eat Noodles, if he's still here, lives in Canada as well. So y'all both could represent Canadians and how that works. And he was saying that he doesn't see gerrymandering happening as much in Canada because of the way their political system works, and it's more kind of local than like mass type of gerrymandering that exists in the United States. Stardew Valley, and it was fun. Yes, it is. It looks fun for sure. But yeah, I would like to have your opinion, Hilda, on gerrymandering. Like, do you think it happens in Canada, or I guess your general opinion of it? Eat Noodle said he doesn't really think it does, but it would be interesting to hear your opinion on it from your perspective. Bohr says, used to live there, always distracting battles going on there. Always districting battles going on there. Yeah, that's probably why they used it as an example, I assume. 538, I do like 538 articles because they tend to be pretty data-driven for the most part. I don't always agree with everything they say, but if I always talk about politics, and especially on the election, I kept going to 538 for their poll analysis and ideas for polling and everything. Because in general, I think they do a very good job at their datas and everything. Hilda says, we have gerrymandering, it's just I don't know why I can't read. More in Canada, we have first past the post voting system. Yeah, I think you were telling me about that earlier. And when I was talking about different voting types in a stream I did months ago now. I think you were telling me about that voting system. So you say that you have it there in Canada as well. I think Noodle said that they had it in some places, just not as big as the scale, if I could speak. But we'll keep reading the article here a little bit. They are better, but they are not fair, Democrats need to win by 1.9% to get the majority instead of 2.7%. The average gap between what Democrats need and what Republicans need, the wasted votes, is 1.8% instead of 2.6%. So by these criteria, about 1/3 of the bias in the map is attributable to gerrymandering. Compact districts are an improvement, but those lines aren't that much closer together. 2/3 of the gap comes from how voters are distributed geographically before they are drawn into congressional districts. Because make no mistake, the way districts are having to be drawn is an extremely complicated process, especially when you have to follow the court mandate of majority-minority districts, which again is not necessarily a bad thing. It is good to have a minority represented in your state and in a district. Especially the states that have bad history, such as Texas, about trying to suppress the minority vote. So that concept is a very good one, but the idea of having to draw these districts and keep the districts fair is a very long, very data-driven process. So the idea that some gerrymandering happens can lead to that as a type and why it might happen. Basically, what I mean by that is gerrymandering the process of redistricting is a complicated and long data-driven process. So it's very hard, even if you have the intent to do it 100% right, to ultimately have a perfect district across every single district in your state. Eat Noodle says here, gerrymandering is not generally a major issue here in Canada except at the civic level. Yeah, that's how you said it earlier, the civic level. And I couldn't really ultimately argue against it because I don't know too much about Canadian politics, but I guess I don't really hear examples of gerrymandering happening too much in Canada compared to obviously the United States, and I do live in the United States, so that could be why. But I try to follow as much as ward politics as I can, and I haven't really heard too many examples come from Canada. Geographic context doesn't mean Democrats are helpless. The courts could require states to draw districts to maximize partisan fairness, not to be compact. One fairest standard would be each state's delegation should be proportional to its vote. Another standard would be that Another standard would be that there should be as many competitive districts as possible. 538 also drew congressional maps following each of those standards. And you see some data here with their charts. These look a lot fairer. Courts have emphasized compactness when ruling on redistricting cases, but they could shift and focus on partisan fairness. Democrats could gain some ground if they just fight for compactness, but unless they fight for partisan fairness, the map will still be biased against them. And Eat Noodle says he's never seen any gerrymandering personally, so that's kind of interesting. I don't know if Texas does have these examples of gerrymandering, so anyway. There are also some more radical options for Democrats. If the Uniform Congressional District Act were repealed, states could shift to multi-member districts, which existed in the early 1800s, or other voting systems entirely like mixed number proportional. So I don't think we should take it as fate that the congressional map will hurt Democrats just because they're clustered in cities. Nonetheless, when people talk about gerrymandering, they tend to mean splitting countries and drawing crazy lines for partisan gain. No one would look at those compact maps of Ohio. I said it right that time. I showed and say those look really gerrymandered, even if they do. In fact, pack Democrats together, so while compactness doesn't produce fairness, it is the norm. And going back to Texas, there was a recent court case called LIPAC or LIPAC. I think it's in here. Let me find it here real quick. I was doing some research, but there was a court case, and basically the court case defined that. Let me find it here real quick. I don't want to. LUAC versus Perry, And Perry was the person who did the lines here in Texas, and LUAC was a Latino group that was trying to sue the state of Texas and say that they let's repeat and say that that they were unfairly drawn, so that they were Latino. So basically saying that they were drawing the district to suppress the Latino the vote. That's what I was trying to say, to suppress the Latino vote. And basically the court came out and said that there is no maximum amounts of redistricting, because they were trying to sue and basically saying that once the new person came in and redraw the lines to suppress the vote, when previously the Latinos had, or at least felt like their reputation was gained, the next person came in and redraw the lines and they felt like their representation wasn't gained and wasn't important or whatever. And the court, and the Supreme Court, basically said that no, there's no maximum amounts that you can redistrict, and you at least have to redistrict once every 12 years, and you are not being discriminated against because we can't legally define that you have been gerrymandered. So once again, it goes back to the political definition and government of trying to reduce gerrymandering or any concept like that. So basically, the Latino voting rights group didn't win that case in the Supreme Court against being discriminalized in their voting. To measure gerrymandering, then, I will compare each state's current map to the compact maps. I will call this partisan gerrymandering as opposed to geographic bias. Democrats won 235 seats under the current map, but win 249 under the compact map. Here's which states are responsible. So they have Texas with their county borders square. Then they have Ohio with county borders being much more, all the way down to California that has much more county borders. Then they have ignore county borders. I think that they don't have a blue margin, but I'm assuming that the margins are the same. They just switch colors from a Republican state to a Democratic state, or a Democrat state. Anecdotally, Texas, Ohio, Florida, and North Carolina are known to be the worst offenders, so it makes sense to see them at the top of the list. On the other side, California's districts were drawn by an independent redistricting commission, but the commission drew competitive districts, and in an ensuing wave, Democrats swept them. Below are the results of 6 different maps that 538 drew. And I'll stop it on these maps here a little bit so that y'all can kind of see it for yourselves. But I'm going to talk about one of the major points here, and we could continue on with the article and go from there. But one of the major points being discussed throughout here is the factor of the states like Texas getting ultimately blamed. And I do think that Texas is responsible for drawing districts to favor their political agenda, and especially since Texas has been historically Republican, and the legislator has been continuously Republican, the idea that more Republican districts exist and the more chances for Republicans to win does make a lot of sense. So the idea that that happens in Republican-leaning states and Republican leadership of states does seem to make sense. But when you compare it to California, a lot of data you see in California suggests that the idea of having a nonpartisan committee to redraw the districts does make a lot of sense, because the idea of the committee being nonpartisan gives the advantage to redrawing districts without a political bias. So the idea that your districts are drawn by someone who, in the ideal ward, doesn't favor a candidate or doesn't put a certain doesn't favor a candidate, it's the best way to put it, and looks at it in the most unbiased way when drawing the districts. It doesn't have a favor to trying to have your friend from the Senate or your friend from the House or your fellow representative from your next district. You want to make sure that they win, so you're going to redraw the district to make sure that your party wins. The idea of it being nonpartisan will allow for things like that not to happen. But once again, I always have to go back to saying I don't think anybody who is human is truly nonpartisan. I think even if it's unbiased, you're at least going to have some sort of bias in who you choose and how you redistrict your lines to favor whoever you necessarily favor. But if you want to make sure that you avoid it as much as possible, having the idea of it being nonpartisan does make sense. But that being said, there are examples in California of districts that do look a little bit suspicious despite them having nonpartisan committees. So every state does have at least one example that looks a little bit suspicious when compared to other states. So I do want to make sure that is also pointed out. And I don't think any district is necessarily perfect. Boris says, gotta make dinner because the salt must flow. Nice to meet y'all. See you around. And thank you for the follow, Bor. I appreciate you stopping by, and I liked your questions. I definitely appreciated your feedback and questions and everything. Hope to see you on another stream of mine in the future, and hopefully you have a good dinner and a good rest of the day/night. But we'll continue on with this article. You can see in the map with round compact districts and the map with county-based compact districts produce almost identical results, even though they look very different. They both say that gerrymandering is responsible for a third of the gap between the parties, and both compact maps say that the Democrats are hurt most in landslide elections like this one. That could suggest that gerrymandering protects Republican incumbents more than it adds new Republican seats, if I can read. So about that 6.7% figure for the Popular Party. Democrats won 53.4% of the vote, while Republicans won 44.8%. That's an 8.6% margin of victory. But there are 41 uncontested races, and 38 of those were Democrats without Republican challenger. And that's another concept as well, and it can go both ways. But another way to kind of fix the political system and the way it works in the United States and really across an entire ward and in whatever country you live in is by having a challenger for every representative of government that happens. Because if you have somebody who represents your government and you have a challenger for every political or governmental position, it would make things a lot more competitive, because especially in America you have the idea of incumbent bias, and the people are just simply going to vote for that person again and again and again and again and again and again. So if you have a challenger and you make every district competitive, it has to make parties and the Republican or Democrat and the way they fund their candidates to be a lot more evenly spread, and instead of just having people in districts that they know are going to win, so they spend money elsewhere. If you make every district evenly competitive, or make every district at least a little bit competitive, you will help the way politics works. Instead of giving the winner 100% of the vote in these districts, I filled in those results by assuming they swung the same amount from 2016 as contested districts. Actually, the same amount after a log odds transformation, which is how I dealt with all the popular vote swings. That actually yields a 6.7%, the popular vote margin we would expect Democrats to have won by had every race been contested. Now some people have been comparing the 8.6% raw unadjusted margin of victory against Republicans' 2010 margin of 6.8%, or the 1994 margin of also 6.8%. Was Democrats' 2018 wave similar than those Republican waves? No, because in 1994 and 2010, 30 and 24 Republicans run unopposed compared to the 14 and 5 Democrats. Seeing a pattern, the economists made an effort to correct for this, and while I don't know their method, they adjusted margins of about 5% in hypothetical elections where no one ran unopposed in each of those Republican wave years. Here's their graphic with my estimated margin of 6.7% for 2018 added. Take a quick drink break here. So you have your results here, and their end article, I guess I'll read it here. In 2016 presidential and the 2012 House elections, Democrats won the popular vote by 2% and lost their election. Republicans won 7 more seats in 2010 than Democrats won this year, despite similar popular vote margin. The bias in the system is here to stay, so tune out anyone who says Democrats' victory wasn't convincing. No one said that in 2010. And I would kind of change their end of the article there. Ultimately, the way gerrymandering exists, I think is still going to happen in politics and in the systems and everything when it relates to that. So I don't ultimately know if that's going to change here in the future or not, really. Just real quick, if you want to follow any of these articles and read it for yourself, come up with your own opinions or whatever, you can definitely follow my YouTube channel at The Breakdown with Birkenhoff, or you can join my Discord server where I link all of my articles and in streams so you can view them for yourself and everything like that. And I also have places for you to suggest things you want me to talk about or anything like that. And I highly appreciate everybody doing so and giving me stream suggestions or anything like that. Next week, I'm probably going to be doing a stream about minorities and the way the government kind of affects minorities and just how poverty kind of works and some ideas around that whole concept. And I'm probably also going to be doing a stream next week over the drug war, because I did a stream over criminal justice reform a couple days ago, and that was a very important stream. And one of the big things we kept running into was the drug wars and the major impact the drug wars had on everything. eNoodle says here, we need to get you affiliated so I can donate bits. Yeah, I would definitely appreciate becoming affiliated, but it's becoming a very, 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 very long process here. But I have gained like 4 or 5 followers in the past 2 weeks, and that's been a pretty significant increase from what it was before. But Twitch has been my biggest growing that I've had on any of my channels. My YouTube is at 67 subscribers now. And that I've had the YouTube channel for a very long time, and I've only really been streaming on Twitch for not too long and already have 24 followers. So Twitch has definitely been the highest growing streaming site or any platform that I'm really on. Yeah, but anyway, you could definitely join my Discord server that is in the description or about section of wherever you're listening to this from, and you can suggest stream topics to me or just talk with me there. I'm trying to become a little bit more active with my Discord. I had a question of the day on my Discord that I used to do where I would just propose a question, either political or non-political, and we would kind of talk about that and do everything about that question and everything. So I might restart the question of the day or do something like that, but I'm trying to become more active myself in Discord and become more active with my community that I'm trying to build, because I'm trying to build a good community and a community that you're free to kind of talk about whatever you want and talk about whatever stream you want me to do or whatever else. Just build up a community that I would like to have, because I did actually, when I was in high school, I did my Discord for a community project, and this is going a little bit side tangent here, but I almost got it to 100 people in that Discord server, and there was at least 20 to 30 people that were continuously on there. So it was very cool to have that many people kind of talking about questions of the days or whatever thing we wanted to talk about. So I guess I'm just trying to rebuild that up and make it like it was in the past, even though it's now a little more political and philosophical. But I do want to mention real quick before I get out of here, my co-host Anna Voltes is going to be doing a stream on Monday with Steven Ingaramus and Carl on YouTube. I guess I could pull his channel up for y'all real quick so you can know who I'm talking about. But they're going to be talking about Trump's executive orders, and they're going to be going over as many executive orders as they can. And it should be rather interesting because Anna Voltes is a part of the Constitutional Party, and he's much more kind of philosophical conservative type minded, but definitely not like a ultra conservative person like a MAGA member or anything like that. He's much more constitutionally based than anything like that. So he's going to be doing a stream with Stephen Ignoramus on his channel, and Stephen Ignoramus is does a lot of music streams and political streams, and recently he's been doing his Sunday streams about Christianity and just kind of playing his guitar. He's a rather fun guy, but he's going to be doing a stream with him, Stephen Ignoramus here, on Monday, and I believe it's 6 p.m. Central Time or 7 p.m. Eastern Time. And they're going to have Carl, who is a leftist, and so they're going to be debating Biden's executive orders from a right perspective and a left perspective, and Stephen's more kind of a monitor in the discussion and trying to get things all discussed there. No, it's not Karl Marx. I don't know if he's ultimately a communist or not, but I definitely know that he is very much on the left side of things. Let me see if I can find his channel. I know I followed him because he's actually a very smart guy from getting a different perspective. I don't agree with him on a lot of things, but he is a very smart guy. I'm going to see if I can find him real quick to get you his exact name. But he might agree with Karl Marx, but his name isn't Karl Marx. There he is. So this is the guy he's going to be doing his stream with, Carl Emmerich, talking about Biden's executive orders on Stephen Ignoramus' channel, like I showed you earlier. So I think it's going to be a rather interesting discussion with him and Anna Votis. And I guess for that matter, I could show you Anna Votis' channel since we're going on our topic streams here. Anna Votis is actually a really smart guy from philosophy type of news. And I have a channel with him, or I have a show with him where we do every Thursday. And this Thursday, we alternate channels, is going to be on his channel. We haven't decided exactly on our topic yet, but our last topic on my stream, or on my channel, The Breakdown with Birkenau, was on the Maslow Pyramid of Hierarchy of Needs. So we did a recent stream on that. And you can see the last episode we did on Intervolta's channel was over the Biden administration and his executive orders. So he's been talking a lot about executive orders recently, it looks like. But you can kind of see a lot of his stream and videos. He usually uploads a couple times a week, but he's definitely a philosophical type of guy as well. And so if you like that sort of stuff, you can definitely check out Anna Votis and his channel for sure. Let's see. You can move this out. Technically, Twitch shouldn't be seeing this right now. I'm not streaming to YouTube. Maybe. Now, my YouTube's been stuck for so long on 67 subscribers, but it's okay. I just have fun. I forgot what I was exactly going to show here. But yeah, here's the stream we did on Maslow, the Hierarchy of Needs. And, I've discussed some police reform, and I'm going to be publishing summary videos on my YouTube just so people don't have to watch the entire 2-hour, 3-hour long streams if they don't want to, and could just catch a summary of what we all kind of discussed, or what I discussed in the channel. But I also wanted to, since I'm here, I guess I'll mention, I recently did a analysis video on the monopoly on violence. So if you like analysis pieces or documentaries, you can definitely check out that piece I did on the monopoly on violence analysis. And it's an anarchist film, so if you are anarchist yourself, you might really like the video I did on it. But if you're not, you'll like what I kind of did to roast anarchy in some perspectives, or to talk about what I liked and didn't like about it. But I'll stay for a little bit longer in case anybody has any other questions about gerrymandering or anything else. I more just kind of got on a side tangent there, but I really liked the previous videos they did together, so I wanted to make sure I mentioned that on my stream. I believe it will be on Twitch as well. Stephen Ignoramus is also on Twitch, So you can give him a follow to watch that on Monday, because I do think that that's going to be a very interesting conversation. So I just wanted to mention that, because I'm kind of a fanboy for that type of content. Albert Robbins says here, would you agree with the notion that Republicans tend to be tit guys and Democrats tend to be ass guys? That's an interesting question. That's something to think about here. I don't know. That's a tough question. I think it's hard to say. I'm a more libertarian minded. I would say I'm probably more the back door than the front. But I would say that I would tend to agree with you on the most part, because every Republican I know tends to be more of a boob guy, and every Democrat I know tends to be more of a backdoor ass type of guy. So I tend to agree with your question there. But I wonder what people would say to that one. I think that would be a very heated question there. Airtight Robin, I think I said your name wrong earlier. I butcher names, as I was mentioning before. But yeah, I'll stay around if anybody has any other questions or comments, but I don't have anything else to talk about as far as gerrymandering. We covered all of my videos and articles I had up talking about it. If anybody has any links they want to share maybe about it, I might stay around for a little bit longer. But I do have to make sure I leave in time to get dinner before it closes. I don't want to be stuck. But I'll stay around for a little bit. All airtight Robin says, do you think Trump is a tit guy or is he faking it? I think Trump's probably both. I think Trump's definitely both. You know, he's a playboy. He's been a playboy in his future for a long time. He's definitely a player for sure. So I think he's probably both for sure. Even though he tends to like the third area a little bit more. So I don't know if he is a tit or ass guy. He may be more of the third area for sure. Who is Jerry and why is he Mandarin? Noodles. Oh goodness. They named it off of a representative that did that. So that is who is Jerry, and why they called it gerrymandering. That's a good question. I don't know why they decided on Mandarin. I forget what the video said at the beginning of the stream. They answered that question, but I have short-term memory loss, so I can't remember what they said. Alright. I'm trying to think what I want to do here. By the way, I guess for anybody that's here, if y'all have any streamers, or not even streamers, but content creators you like to watch, you can definitely link their channels in the description there, whatever you're listening to, and I'll definitely check them out, because I'm looking for more people to just kind of listen to or watch their content, because I've kind of been listening to the same people for a couple months now, and I'm starting to get a little bit tired of what they all have to say. So if you have any suggestions of people to look at and follow, I would definitely appreciate that. And you can either put that in the comments now or add them to my Twitter or Discord. And I'll go ahead and post that again just to make sure. There's my Discord. And there's my Twitter. So you can definitely check those out or give me any comments or people you think I should watch either through there or in the comment sections now. Because I'm just looking for more people to kind of pay attention to a little bit. Eaton Little says, do you watch Sinos? I think that's how you say it. That rings a bell. I think I've used to watch it before. But I couldn't say for certain. I don't think I know exactly who they are. Are they a Twitch person or a YouTube person? I can look. That seems like a Twitch username. Is that Twitch or YouTube there? Eat noodles. Yeah, that looks like Twitch. Yeah, Twitch. Yeah, that's what I thought. It sounded like a Twitch name. It's kind of funny how you could tell which are more Twitch names or what are more YouTube names. Even though a lot of times they're the same name, but just kind of funny. I figured it was probably Twitch just from that name. I think I've watched them before. It's loading. It is very slow. My computer is very slow. That's why I always have these articles preloaded, especially when it comes to those scientific journals. I have to make sure that it's still signed in, and when I do load things, or what am I saying? I have to make sure that everything's signed in and ready to go, because scientific journals oftentimes tend to kick you out if you don't automatically like go on there, or it kicks you out after a certain amount of time, I think is what it does. But yeah, I actually have listened to him before. I'm not signed into my account here because I'm watching it on my monitor, and I don't want to really leave that when I'm streaming. But I have listened to him before, and I don't think I'm followed to him, but occasionally I just kind of stop by his channel. I do recognize his face, so I have listened to him before there, Noodles, and he's definitely more of a conservative streamer. So I'd probably agree with him on a lot of things, but not everything by any means. I don't really agree with anybody on everything. Anybody that is a full fanboy of anybody is a little suspicious to me. I don't think anybody you should go into and say, yeah, I agree with everything he has to say. Then you know that your mind has kind of become a little bit cultish or anything. You're a little bit too persuaded easily if you start to agree with everything somebody is saying. That's kind of my viewpoint on that. Maybe I'm a little bit extreme or whatever word you want to use, but that's kind of how I view that. I'm not seeing anything else as far as content, but once again, you can always follow me on those channels or anything to mention anybody. Let me go back to YouTube here. Actually, I have the YouTube up already. Oh yeah, if you ever want like offensive content, you can definitely check out Soup. He is hilarious. If you ever want to watch something that's super stupid and silly and really kind of offensive, you can definitely watch Soup's content on YouTube. I think he has a Twitch channel too, but he doesn't on Twitch very often. But his content is hilarious. But yeah, I watch this guy all the time. He streams at 8 and it's almost 6 here. So I have some time to stay around a little bit, but I'm getting a little bit hungry. Anyway, but I listen to his channel all the time on Sundays. They have a show. Once again, I don't really agree with everything he has to say, but if you want to watch somebody on YouTube and their content, you can definitely check out Matt. His channel is pretty good on his Sunday video with his co-host. Also, if you watch any of my Justice or Police streams, you know Larry Lawton. I've been on a big phase on him, on his police reform and justice reform and content like that. And I'm going to have a summary video, as I've said before, on my YouTube channel about those streams in case you don't want to watch those whole 2-3 hour long streams I've done on those topics. And Jessica Kent was also somebody we've watched videos on before. Yeah, I'm just kind of seeing anybody else that I've been watching recently. I've been watching a lot of stupid stuff because I've been on Twitch for a lot of my political content recently. And then I go on YouTube for more of my stupid stuff recently. Oh, here you go. Look at that. It's scheduled for 2/1. That's what we were just talking about. So yeah, that's tomorrow at 7 p.m. My time. So I guess that's 8 p.m. Eastern then, since that's adjusted to my time. But that's the show I was just talking about recently with Steven and his alternate channel with Ignoramus Media. And if you want more like lawyer content, I used to recommend Legal Eagle a lot, but I don't know if I ultimately agree a lot with Legal Eagle recently and what he's been saying. But he tends to be generally okay on a lot of things. But this is a lawyer that's definitely a lot more right-leaning compared to Legal Eagle than left-leaning. So I tend to watch his YouTube show on the topic and then go to Legal Eagle's YouTube show. And whatever's kind of in the middle is kind of what I take away from both perspectives. So yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to mention there. But I'm gonna go ahead and have to get going here, since I have to catch dinner. It doesn't close right now because it's only 6 here, but I'm kind of hungry, so I'm gonna go ahead and stop here since I kind of finished all I wanted to talk about. I appreciate the raid earlier, Hell Knight. I appreciate the follow, Eat Noodles and Boar, and thank you Emma, Eat Noodles, Scott's, Hilda Beast, and all Airtight Robin for stopping by and commenting and giving your input. I highly appreciate all of that. It makes the streams much more fun and a lot better. So I highly appreciate that. And once again, thank you, Boar, for the follow on Trovo. I highly appreciate that as well. But I am going to have to get going here. Thank you, everybody, for stopping by. And again, you can definitely recommend suggestions on my Twitter or Discord if you want me to talk about and learn about a certain topic. Thank you, and I hope you'll catch me on the next stream.